Posso começar, Porto? Boa tarde a todas e todos. Can you hear? Bill, you hear? Bill. Esperando só para ver se os nossos convidados podem nos ouvir em inglês. Okay. Bom, boa tarde a todas e todos. É uma grande alegria, um prazer começarmos aqui o evento de encerramento do primeiro evento que nós chamamos de Regulation Week. Eu vou fazer um rápido agradecimento a todos e todas aqui. Primeiro, agradecer a todos que se dispuseram a estar aqui conosco, agradecer aqueles que vieram de longe. O evento de encerramento faz parte da nossa iniciativa na FGV Direito Rio de criar um verdadeiro ambiente de discussão qualificada sobre problemas regulatórios, desafios regulatórios que os estados precisam enfrentar dentro da sua função regulatória. Hoje é o nosso evento de encerramento, na sexta-feira, em que nós vamos ter um debate mais aberto. Nós começamos a Regulation Week na segunda-feira em Houston. O professor Sérgio Guerra, nosso diretor, esteve lá iniciando essa jornada. Na terça-feira nós estivemos em São Paulo para debater desafios regulatórios nos setores de seguros e previdência. Na quarta-feira estivemos em Brasília, dentro da nossa parceria com a PPG de Brasília, para debater, na parte da manhã, a infraestrutura aeroportuária e, na parte da tarde, o setor de portos. Na quinta-feira debatemos ferrovias e hoje terminamos o evento tendo a honra de receber aqui palestrantes internacionais para debater desafios regulatórios de uma maneira mais ampla. Quero agradecer em primeiro lugar, o nosso time interno da FGV, que tornou possível esse evento. Em especial, quero agradecer a Ludmila e toda a sua equipe, agradecer também ao Marcos e a sua equipe, agradecer à equipe do Regulação em Números, todos os professores e pesquisadores que aqui estão e que também contribuíram decisivamente para esse evento acontecer. Eu quero agradecer os nossos patrocinadores e apoiadores que acreditaram desde o primeiro momento que esse seria um projeto importante, para o desenvolvimento econômico e social do país, dos setores regulados. E quero agradecer especialmente aos nossos palestrantes. Nós temos aqui o professor Donald Elliott, da Universidade de Yale, temos aqui a professora Wendy Wagner, da Universidade do Texas, e temos aqui o prefeito Bill de Blasio. Eu encorajo a todos e todas que tragam suas perguntas. Os norte-americanos apreciam muito debates, apresentações curtas e o que eles chamam de Q&A, de perguntas e respostas. Eles estão acostumados, eles gostam disso. O Bill de Blasio, a caminho aqui do auditório, me pediu, inclusive, para que eu fizesse uma apresentação dele muito rápida. Ele falou, diga apenas que eu fui prefeito de Nova York e que meu mandato terminou em 2021. E é isso, eu quero começar a conversar com todos e quero ouvir das pessoas as perguntas, o que eles têm a dizer sobre os aspectos que ele vai tratar, que é basicamente sobre Smart City. Então, feito esse agradecimento inicial, eu quero convidar o presidente da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, o professor Carlos Simonsen, a compor a mesa de abertura, o professor Sérgio Guerra.
Bom, queria dar boa tarde a todos, dizer da minha satisfação, da minha alegria de estar aqui para fazer o encerramento da Regulation Week. Queria dizer da alegria, agradecer muito a presença do nosso presidente da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, professor Carlos Ivan Simonsen Leal, e dos palestrantes que já foram anunciados. Espero que estejam gostando do Rio de Janeiro, da estadia aqui na FGV Direito Rio. E esse encontro, como o Péricles disse, né, vamos ser bastante objetivos aqui nessa parte inicial para poder passar a palavra para o professor Carlos Ivan, é dizer por que nós fizemos uma Regulation Week. Né? Primeiro em inglês, termo em inglês, porque é um evento internacional. Como o Péricles avisou, nós estivemos segunda-feira em Houston, conhecida como a capital global, a capital mundial da energia, do petróleo, do gás. Fizemos o primeiro evento em Houston. Depois nós tivemos um evento em São Paulo, discutindo toda a regulação da indústria do seguro, né? E o seguro como regulação é um tema muito importante. Tivemos também um evento para discutir a infraestrutura aeroportuária, a estrutura portuária e a indústria ferroviária, é um modal muito importante no Brasil, é um sistema ferroviário nacional que precisa ser muito discutido e ampliado no Brasil. E hoje nós temos esse encerramento para falar um pouco mais aberto sobre regulação e também trazendo esse enfoque internacional com os nossos convidados que estão vindo dos Estados Unidos da América. Então, por isso, o Regulation Week First Edition, né, a primeira edição do Regulation Week. É um evento que a gente vai manter anualmente. A ideia é que ele não seja simplesmente um evento acadêmico, ele se transforme num movimento a favor dos debates sobre a regulação no país. Porque praticamente tudo no Brasil é regulado. Então, do ponto de vista jurídico, do ponto de vista da discussão sobre o aperfeiçoamento do Estado de Direito brasileiro, a regulação é muito importante. E a nossa Escola de Direito, que tem como lema, que tem como princípio, ser uma escola de realidade, uma escola que estuda e que pesquisa a realidade brasileira, ela escolheu o tema da regulação como um dos pontos importantes do Estado de Direito a ser bastante profundamente estudado, pesquisado aqui pelos nossos alunos e alunas. Então, nós temos um forte programa de pós-graduação, o mestrado e o doutorado em Direito da Regulação. Nós temos projetos de pesquisa, como regulação em números e outros, e nós temos comitês temáticos que estudam e discutem entre governo, academia e a indústria, de forma neutra, dentro da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, como melhorar o ambiente de negócio no Brasil, envolvendo esses setores, e, obviamente, como melhorar também os aspectos sociais que advêm do desenvolvimento desses setores. Então, é dentro dessa ideia é que nós criamos a Regulation Week e vamos, então, ter esse dia de hoje, essa tarde de hoje, para fazer essa análise comparada do que tem sido feito nos Estados Unidos, que inspirou o modelo brasileiro. Nós chamamos de transplante jurídico, né, de legal transplant. Né? Esse transplante jurídico que houve no Brasil, com a ideia de criação de entidades reguladoras independentes, as Regulatory Commissions, Independent Regulatory Agencies, né? Muito próximo ao modelo norte-americano do Administrative State. Mas nós não temos no Brasil um Administrative State. Nós temos algumas agências reguladoras, nós temos 11 agências reguladoras, para ser mais preciso, nós temos um banco central que é independente, nós temos uma agência de valores imobiliários, né, independente, nós temos uma agência também que vê a parte antitrust, também é independente, e recentemente houve a criação da Autoridade Nacional de Proteção de Dados, e mais recentemente a criação da Autoridade Nacional de Segurança Nuclear. Todas essas entidades, de alguma maneira, se inspiram no modelo norte-americano, se inspiram no modelo do Administrative State. Mas, como eu disse, nós estamos no modelo híbrido, onde nós temos uma parte muito forte de centralized government, na mão do presidente da República e dos seus ministros, e uma parte nas mãos dos reguladores. Então, esse é o ambiente híbrido que existe no Brasil, e para nós termos aqui uma opening remarks, para fazer exatamente essa introdução, uma visão mais macro, o professor Carlos Ivan Simões Leal, que ele deve comentar isso, mas eu já vou antecipar, não é advogado, é engenheiro, né, com formação também em matemática, em Princeton, e ele, então, vai fazer, né, tivemos essa honra de tê-lo aqui conosco para fazer uma abertura sobre o Brasil, sobre esse olhar global, internacional, e depois, então, nós passamos para os outros painéis. Então, muito obrigado a todos, espero que todos tenham um ótimo encontro nessa tarde. Passo a palavra ao professor Carlos Ivan Simões Leal.
Bom dia a todos. Eu peço aos nossos visitantes que, se não me entenderem, que se a tradução não for boa, me interrompam e eu explico em inglês também. Lost in translation is a reality anywhere. Okay? So, eu vou começar. O Sérgio contou aqui um segredo. Eu sou engenheiro, não sou advogado. Então, eu obviamente, às vezes fico feito burro olhando para o palácio. Mas tem uma vantagem, que eu entendo as coisas, às vezes, sobre uma outra ótica. Eu vou contar uma pequena história que me aconteceu, e que eu tive a experiência alguns anos atrás, em Buenos Aires. Estava eu em Buenos Aires, na Casa Rosada, tratando de algum assunto que nada tinha a ver com o que eu vou falar, mas eu estava lá naquele instante, na sala ao lado do presidente da República Argentina, que era Cristina Kirchner, que não estava na sala. Eu tinha chegado na Casa Rosada. Eu sou um sujeito pequeno, frágil, que ninguém pode pensar que eu seja capaz de ser alguma ameaça para quem quer que seja. Passei no detetor de metais e o detetor de metais disparou. Eu puxei o meu telefone e mostrei o telefone e o sujeito da porta me disse: vai. Eu podia estar ali com um Colt 45 dentro do paletó, não tem problema. Ele me mandou passar e eu passei. Aquele detalhe, aquele amor ao detalhe que às vezes aqui na América Latina as pessoas têm. O diabo está sempre nos detalhes, tá certo? Eu subi, tive minha reunião e na hora de saída, a presidente ainda não havia chegado, mas estavam chegando as pessoas que vinham para o anúncio da reestatização da antiga YPF, Yacimento Petrolíferos qualquer coisa, Argentina, que pertencia à Repsol. E chegavam eufóricos. Os políticos estavam chegando eufóricos. Era quase que uma desforra da honra nacional que você estava reestatizando a YPF. Estranhamente, eu demorei um pouco na porta para sair, estranhamente, quem chegou com o ar deprimido foram os sindicalistas. Eu fico me perguntando se eles entenderam, se eles estavam entendendo o que estava acontecendo ali e que possivelmente o crédito da Argentina, o investimento estrangeiro, ia desabar depois daquele fato e que, obviamente, ia haver menos emprego. Tá? Como aconteceu. Isso tudo é história e aconteceu. Mas eu não sei o que é que eles estavam pensando, eu apenas vi as caras. Fiquei um pouco de tempo ali, uma assistente minha esqueceu uma mala na porta, por onde a presidente ia falar, uma pequena mala que podia ter uma bomba, no caso só tinha a roupa dela, mas saímos e eu fui para a Procuradoria-Geral da República Argentina, onde o procurador-geral da época virou-se para mim e disse o que achou, eufórico. Ele estava eufórico. O que achou? Eu então resolvi dizer, eu achei extraordinário. Eu disse 2 palavras, mas ele ouviu uma palavra só. Quando você diz 2 palavras tem um significado, quando você ouve uma palavra tem outro. Foi perfeito. Saímos todos felizes, eu fui jantar, a comida no jantar foi muito boa. Tá certo? Então, eu queria fazer essa observação, porque ali tem um caso muito marcante de como a falta de uma boa regulação, não saber lidar com a falta dessa boa regulação, gerou um problema de curto, médio e longo prazo, muito grande e muito difícil, que provavelmente, isso nunca foi calculado, prejudicou muitíssimo a República Argentina. Por quê? Uma razão simples. Quando privatizaram a YPF, era necessário que houvesse um aparato regulatório que controlasse algumas coisas que eu presumo deveriam de estar no contrato. Como, por exemplo, um nível mínimo de investimentos que garantisse a continuidade da autonomia argentina no suprimento de petróleo. A razão, aliás, alegada para que fosse feita a reestatização é porque a Repsol estaria, isso é o que eu me lembro da época, pode ser que eu esteja enganado, e são tudo alegações, eu não sei se são verdadeiras ou não. Como eu estou numa plateia de advogados, eu tenho que fazer todas as ressalvas possíveis. Então, eles viraram e disseram o seguinte: olha, não tem investimento suficiente, a produção está caindo, nós vamos reestatizar. Isso era a conversa que eu ouvia em Buenos Aires. E isso foi feito. Mas isso, obviamente, não ter o investimento e não ter diferentes alertas ao longo do tempo que criassem uma história para haver a reestatização ou uma intervenção, isso foi falha de um aparato regulatório que não existia, ou que era incipiente, ou que não tinha a noção do que deveria de fazer, da importância de fazê-lo. Essa é a primeira observação que eu quero fazer. Se naquele instante a Argentina tivesse um aparato regulatório que tivesse supervisionado, tivesse dito, olha, vocês não estão investindo, provasse isso, a reação mundial seria diferente. A história que passou no mundo era uma história de que, não, reestatizaram simplesmente porque ficaram com vontade de reestatizar. E a história que você ouvia em Buenos Aires era outra. Mas como saber qual era a verdadeira? Dependeria de ter tido um acompanhamento regulatório verdadeiro, eficaz. Isso, ao que me parece, não era o caso. Então, essa observação é muito importante. Aí eu vou para o que o Sérgio disse, que nós copiamos várias coisas, várias instituições legais de outras instituições no mundo. Nosso Código Comercial foi baseado no Código Comercial francês, napoleônico, aliás, o de vários países, que nós copiamos a regulação, o espírito regulatório dos Estados Unidos e assim por diante. Eu gostaria de dizer que, infelizmente, o grande ídolo do direito brasileiro, Rui Barbosa, copiou o federalismo americano no Brasil. O federalismo americano era o federalismo de um país onde a nação criou o Estado. E o Brasil é um país onde o Estado estava criando a nação. Também não... Até hoje nós temos problemas. Esses problemas não são mais resolvíveis. São convivíveis, mas não são resolvíveis. A segunda observação que eu faço é a seguinte. É importantíssimo ver o que a gente copia e ver se as hipóteses subjacentes, the underlying hypotheses, são as mesmas ou não. Porque simplesmente querer copiar um arcabouço, uma estrutura de implementação legal, sem saber se o que está embaixo é da mesma natureza, se o funcionamento, se a cultura, se as outras leis permitem aquilo, isso não necessariamente vai dar certo. Essa é a minha segunda observação. Nós fizemos e tínhamos que fazer uma série de privatizações de utilidades públicas em algum momento, 30 anos atrás, e implantamos uma série de agências reguladoras. Essas agências reguladoras, elas, para começar, tem alguma coisa, o poder delas foi dado pelo Congresso. Mas, digamos assim, há quem conteste, embora hoje essas vozes sejam menores, se o Congresso tinha o direito de transferir certos poderes dele permanentemente para a agência reguladora sem passar por uma reforma constitucional. Isso é uma característica do nosso funcionamento constitucional. Então começa por aí. Mas foi feito. E depois, a nossa Constituição, para aqueles que não são brasileiros, ela tem 200 páginas. Isso dificulta muito, porque tem uma série de coisas que diz não pode isso, não pode aquilo, não pode. Então, nesses não podes, eu sempre arranjo um não pode que atrapalha qualquer coisa que você imagine. A americana tem uma página só, é muito mais fácil de não contrariá-la. Não deu tempo para escrever tanta coisa numa página só. As agências reguladoras foram criadas no Brasil e, ao contrário de um lento processo como houve nos Estados Unidos, na Inglaterra, e depois copiado, mas com muito aprendizado no Japão, Alemanha, você começou várias agências reguladoras sem uma estrutura, uma cultura técnica para as áreas específicas suficientemente profunda, em primeiro lugar. Segundo, você começou com um corpo técnico pequeno, insuficiente às vezes para o volume de tarefas e de atividades que tinha que desenvolver. Tudo bem, isso é história, são 30 anos, você acumulou por causa disso erros e acertos, a política evoluiu, a política se meteu, o problema de gestão das agências reguladoras é um problema grave, porque como disse o Sérgio, nós vivemos numa república mais presidencialista do que os Estados Unidos, tá certo? Isso é decorrência de um fato que muita gente ignora. Nós estamos há 250 anos numa longa discussão sobre a natureza do Estado. Nós herdamos a discussão jansenista jesuíta da França, tá certo? Temos a periódica necessidade, como a França também, de um salvador da pátria. Então, tudo isso soma, com mais as características culturais e tudo mais. Algumas coisas funcionaram muito bem, outras funcionaram mal. As que funcionaram bem não necessariamente funcionaram como funcionariam nos Estados Unidos, funcionaram bem por outras razões, tá certo? E mal também. Foi um grande experimento que continua acontecendo até hoje, e que hoje também, como a questão do federalismo, da introdução do federalismo aqui, também já enraizou, e agora trata-se de, vamos dizer assim, resolver os problemas resultantes. Mas tem um terceiro aspecto, que é mais complicado e que está se colocando hoje. Eu não estou oferecendo solução alguma, eu só estou dizendo os problemas que nós temos. O terceiro aspecto é o seguinte: o Brasil, por mais que os brasileiros desejassem estar no planeta Marte, o Brasil está no planeta Terra. E isso é quase que uma dificuldade. Nós temos muito uma mentalidade para este problema muito parecida com a dos Estados Unidos de 1910. Nós ignoramos muito, no caso específico de regulação, o efeito e o movimento dos diferentes marcos regulatórios ao redor do mundo. No caso, o que mais nos afeta é a regulação na Europa e regulação nos Estados Unidos. E o que isso provoca? Muito simples. Vamos dizer que eu tenha uma multinacional numa área sensível, numa área de utilidade pública, cujo suprimento dos produtos que ela possui, que ela produz, seja uma questão de segurança nacional. Ou seja, que o país não funciona sem aquilo funcionar direito. E aí você tem uma crise energética mundial, vamos supor que seja na área de energia, para facilitar, para dar nome aos bois. E você tem uma crise energética mundial e as matrizes estejam sendo forçadas a fazer uma mudança na fonte de produção de energia. Se são termoelétricas, ou se é queima de termoelétrica a carvão, ou a diesel, ou a gás, eu tenho que mudar para energia solar, para energia eólica, e isso requer dinheiro, requer investimento. Bom, a matriz, cujo diretor, cujo CEO tem a sua casa naquele país, vai obedecer à regulação daquele país em primeiro lugar e vai procurar atender a necessidade de investimento que ele tem ali o mais rápido possível. E vai simplesmente pegar o fluxo de caixa de outros lugares onde a regulação é mais fraca, onde a regulação é menos incisiva, menos competente, os efeitos são mais lentos, onde, digamos assim, o seu mercado de capitais não esteja localizado, onde o seu crédito, o seu funding, e vai desviar o seu fluxo de caixa, eu diria até de um ponto de vista legítimo, tá certo? Ele está maximizando a sua utilidade, ele vai desviar para atender o seu problema local, na sua matriz, primeiro. Então, hoje em dia, países da América do Sul enfrentam e eu acredito na América Latina toda, mas a informação que eu tenho sobre a América do Sul, eles enfrentam esse dilema. A própria regulação atual em vários locais, ela não alerta para isso. Esse problema não foi pensado, mas o cash flow está indo maciçamente para fora para financiar mudanças energéticas em outros locais. Estou dando apenas um exemplo de como você não pode pensar, que é o terceiro problema, você não pode pensar em regulação para certas áreas sem pensá-la num contexto global e, sobretudo, sem levar em conta que não existe apenas, não é um mercado perfeito, não é um mercado competitivo, não são milhares de empresas, são, em cada um desses mercados locais, são poucas empresas no mundo comparadas. Isso é uma coisa que você está enfrentando, regulação de oligopólios globais com regulação local. Então, isso é o terceiro problema. Então, para repetir, eu vejo um problema que você tem que saber como lidar com regulação, como implementá-la, inclusive para criar uma reputação de que a regulação é justa, fair, tá certo? Ela é justa para o investidor, ela é justa para o consumidor, ela é previsível, tá certo? Ela é justa para o credor da empresa. Isso é um problema. Segundo problema é que nós temos um histórico de regulação, mas eu não conheço lugar algum no mundo em que a regulação seja perfeita. Nem nos Estados Unidos regulação é perfeita, tá certo? E se for olhar a diferença entre os estados e as agências reguladoras locais, você também vai ver que tem muita coisa que não é tão assim maravilhosa. Esse é o segundo problema. Nós temos que subir o nosso padrão, o nosso aparato técnico, a nossa capacidade, digamos assim, até o bom senso na aplicação disso. O terceiro ponto é que o jogo pode, em algumas áreas, não ser só a sua regulação contra aquela empresa, mas a sua regulação vis-à-vis o mundo. Os três aspectos interagem. Os três aspectos são importantes. Isso é muito, as pessoas tendem a não compreender a importância de levar isso tudo em consideração. Mais ainda, no Brasil, existe uma tendência a você rejeitar um conceito que é muito bom e muito prático, que em finanças eu conheço nos Estados Unidos com o nome de regra do homem prudente, Prudent Man Rule, que é aplicada a gestores financeiros. Você não pode ser imprudente quando você gere o dinheiro de terceiros. O que quer dizer ser imprudente? Muito simples. Um bom gestor, ele tem que fazer o máximo de esforço para coletar toda a informação disponível no momento. E tem que aplicar modelos racionais a esta informação para poder tomar a sua decisão. Se depois disso um meteoro cair em cima da fábrica que ele fez ou do investimento que ele fez, não é problema dele. Tá certo? E ele é julgado apenas uma vez por isso. Ele não é julgado 10 anos depois que saiu do cargo, se houve um desastre não previsto e que talvez ele devesse prever ou não. É óbvio que eu estou simplificando, mas a tendência que existe no nosso pensamento jurídico de intervir, fazendo regredir regras atuais para o passado, isso é extremamente nocivo porque gera uma instabilidade de comportamento onde todo mundo começa a querer olhar para a agência reguladora de uma forma que não é boa. Esse é aquele ponto que o Roberto Campos, em 1964, lutou muito contra e proibiu, quando foi feita a nova Constituição em 64. Qual era? Tribunal de Contas não é gestor, Tribunal de Contas é supervisor. Se você transformar a agência reguladora em gestora, você não resolve o problema, você amplia o problema. E o fato de você transformar em gestora, você pode fazer de várias formas, inclusive formas veladas. Então existe um caminho aí que não é só o da regulamentação, de escrever regras. É também o caminho da regulação. Que é a capacidade de tirar dúvidas. Tá certo? E sobre isso, espero que depois se possa discutir mais. Tudo isso colocado, eu diria que o nosso desafio é tremendo. Porque nós estamos num momento em que o mundo está mudando. É um momento de um desafio tremendo. Nós temos que parar de pensar que estamos no planeta Marte. É engraçado, abrindo um parênteses, os brasileiros, eles têm duas sensações. Primeiro, adoraríamos estar no planeta Marte. Essa é a primeira, eu já disse. A segunda é a seguinte, é que nós estamos bem juntinho do mundo ocidental. Uma vez eu peguei um avião, na época que a Rússia ainda não tinha feito guerra, aí eu peguei um avião de Tóquio para Londres e levei 10 horas e meia voando. Depois vim para o Rio de Janeiro, vindo de Londres, e levei 12 horas. E se eu saísse em qualquer lugar do Rio de Janeiro perguntando o que está mais perto de Londres, Tóquio ou Rio de Janeiro, aqui todo mundo ia responder, Rio de Janeiro está mais perto de Londres. Então nós precisamos levar em consideração todos esses problemas e regulação você não vai nunca conseguir, a meu ver. O Sérgio disse que eu era engenheiro. Eu sou engenheiro, sim, com muito orgulho, engenheiro civil, mas também tenho um doutorado em teoria dos jogos, tá certo? Então, olhando para o que eu sei de teoria dos jogos, sabe qual é o dia que você vai chegar a uma... É bom esse negócio de regulação. Eu devia ter estudado direito, porque o dia que vai acabar a regulação, provavelmente é porque Jesus Cristo desceu à Terra.
Sou Carlos Ivan, Simão Cilial, por essa importante nossa contextualização. O Brasil, ele é o maior país da América Latina, como nós sabemos, a nona economia mundial, tem muitas oportunidades de negócio, mas tem uma frase aqui no Brasil, que lá fora as pessoas às vezes perguntam o que significa. O Brasil não é um país para amadores, né? Brasil is not for beginners. E tem a ver com essa com essa introdução que o professor Carlos Ivan fez. Há uma grande complexidade no país, em função da forma como ele foi criado, da forma como os poderes foram organizados, mas o importante é que, como ele disse, a regulação vai ter que ser estudada, né, a vida inteira, e nós aqui focamos exatamente nisso, professor Carlos Ivan, de formar, discutir, pesquisar sobre regulação. Eu agradeço mais uma vez muito ao professor Carlos Ivan e passo ao Péricles, então, para dar sequência ao evento. Obrigado.
Vamos dar seguimento ao nosso último dia da Regulation Week. Eu gostaria de convidar, em primeiro lugar, o professor Antônio Maristrello Porto, que é o vice-diretor da Escola de Direito, servirá como mediador. Eu gostaria de convidar a professora Wendy Wagner, da Texas School of Law. E eu gostaria de convidar o professor Donald Elliott, da Yale Law School. Seguindo a ideia aqui de ser muito breve nas apresentações e o mais objetivo possível, nós que estudamos regulação aqui, a única coisa que eu gostaria de dizer acerca dos dois professores é que eles são dois professores, são duas escolas gigantes nos Estados Unidos. Nós temos aqui uma rica oportunidade de ouvir essas duas autoridades e como nós temos aqui muitos alunos também, eu gostaria de dizer que dentro da missão da escola, de ser uma escola internacional, a presença da professora Wendy e do professor Donald faz parte dos nossos relacionamentos. O professor Donald foi professor do Sérgio Guerra durante o pós-doutoramento em Yale e da professora Natasha também, durante o LLM que ela fez em Yale. E a professora Wendy, essa simpatia, eu tive o prazer e a honra de conhecer durante meu período de pesquisa na Harvard Kennedy School. Então, eles vão utilizar, após a apresentação, o aparelho de tradução, para que todos fiquem absolutamente à vontade e tragam perguntas sobre as questões que iremos debater. Por favor.
Boa tarde a todas e a todos. É uma felicidade poder fazer parte, de alguma maneira, dessa semana tão maravilhosa. Queria aproveitar aqui o momento para dar os parabéns ao Péricles e a toda a equipe da Escola de Direito, à Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Hoje, nesse momento, a gente vai falar um pouquinho, vou passar aqui para o inglês, Design Governmental Institutions to Protect the Environment, How Brazil can Learn from the US Mistakes. E nós vamos iniciar esse painel, como o Pérez acabou de colocar, com duas palestras, duas exposições, que depois vai estar aberto a perguntas, se a gente tiver tempo, se a gente tiver algumas perguntas. Eu gostaria, nesse momento, de avisar que eu resumi bastante o currículo dos professores aqui, para não tomar muito tempo. Então, Professor Wagner is a leading authority on the use of science by environmental policymakers. She received a Master's of Environmental Studies and her law degree both from Yale. Before entering teaching, she practiced for 4 years, first as an honor attorney in the Enforcement Division of the Department of Justice, Environment and Natural Research Division, and then as a Pollution Control Coordinator with the Department of Agriculture's Office of the General Counsel. Prior to joining the faculty at the University of Texas, Professor Wagner taught at Case Western Law School and was a visiting professor at Columbia and Vanderbilt Law Schools. Professor Wagner's research focuses on the intersection of law and science, with particular attention to environmental policies. Professor Wagner published several articles and books that received the most prestigious awards and honors. She has served on several national academies of science committees and also served on the governing. Professor Wagner is a member scholar of the Center for Progressive Reform. Please help me to salute Professor Wagner. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. I am truly honored and thrilled to be part of Regulation Week, and particular thanks to Pericles for including me in this and putting this amazing event together. This is actually my very first time in Rio, and so I am completely amazed by the gorgeous natural beauty you have, and also by the warm, generous hospitality, which I love. But as an environmental lawyer, I'm also very excited to be here because of all the exciting, innovative things that are going on in Brazil, particularly with respect to the environment. So I've read about the ecological transition plan and all the capabilities that Brazil has to try to bring sustainable environments and economies into the same place. And I think it's well positioned to be a world leader in innovative initiatives and strategies. When I tried to learn a little bit more about the ecological transition plan, though, I hit upon some headlines, I'm sharing some of them, that suggested that there was some anxiety in Brazil about whether the regulatory agencies are really up to the task and whether they can resist some of the pressures for development in mining and oil and gas. And the headlines just came on and on and on in that respect. And so it's actually that topic that I want to talk about. Specifically, how have we designed the regulatory state to do the work that we want of it? And in that respect, I think the United States has a great deal of mistakes to share with you that hopefully you won't make or are not making now. So, like Brazil, the United States has 55 years of extremely ambitious environmental and public health laws. We have high goals and hundreds of pages of text to protect the environment and advance public health. But in the United States, there are too many cases of severe disappointments in our ability to actually see those laws implemented or enforced. And I would say some of them are actually outright failures. Now, part of the reason may have to do with agencies, but what I'm going to argue in this talk is another primary reason that the United States is struggling and sometimes failing has to do with the actual architecture that we have set up to expect the agencies to do their work and their processes. Of course, the substance of the laws matter a great deal too, and I think my partner in crime up here, Don Elliott, will talk about a lot of substantive issues as well as some process issues. But what I want to focus on in my talk is the process, sort of the invisible machine of how the regulatory agencies are assigned to do their work. And in the United States, we've found, I think, that even the most excellent looking legal texts and laws, and even the most committed presidents who are determined to do environmental good, still are not able to get these programs to function because of the way we've actually designed the process. And so, as a lot of lawyers, I think, are familiar, without a good process, you actually can't get a lot done. And this is one of my favorite quotes that I teach from one of our most famous Congressman, Dingell. And it says, and he was saying this to an opponent in Congress, "I'll let you write the substance of the statute, and you let me write the procedure, and I'll screw you every time." So if you take nothing from this talk, the one lesson I want to give you is, and I think we've already heard this from President Carlos, the devil is in the details, and we need to look at how we've designed the regulatory processes as well as the statutory goals we've set. Okay, so also like President Carlo, I am going to share three things. These are the three mistakes I consider the most serious in how we've designed the regulatory state that hopefully may be helpful to Brazil. I want to start with a little bit of introduction, though, just to make sure we have a sort of understanding for purposes of comparison. In the United States, the way our regulatory system is set up, the agencies are called the fourth branch of government. They sit directly under the management of the President and White House. Congress, our legislature, gives the agency their instructions. So the agencies do what Congress tells them to do, but the President essentially manages them. We don't have any constitutional protections for health or in the environment. Now, as I mentioned, we have, since 1970, passed a lot of very, very ambitious environmental laws. Many have been amended, and they probably total over 1,000 pages, I would say. And some parts of those statutes have been highly successful. And I think Don will talk about a few of the successes. And I'm happy to go into Q&A on the things we might be doing particularly right, and why, in light of this terrible regulatory design, we do have success. But what I want to focus on are the money disappointments. And in that regard, we actually have quite a few. Just to give you a few highlights, I would say that our regulation of chemicals in the United States, these are the chemicals in commerce, is close to a complete failure, if not a complete failure. We have 50,000 chemicals in commerce, and since 1976, our regulatory agency with a big, long statute has only managed to restrict a handful of those 50,000, and the vast majority of those 50,000 chemicals, we know very little about their safety or toxicity, and they don't meet the minimum standards. As a result, we have rolling disasters in the United States. PFAS is sort of the latest chemical. A second example, in the United States, we have a lot of legal attention to air and water. And yet there are places in the United States where the air is still not safe to breathe, many actually in Texas, my home state. And we also have lots of areas where the water is not safe to fish in, to bathe in, or to eat the fish. Even in our huge Great Lakes, we have fish advisories where it's not safe to eat the fish. This is despite the fact that the agencies were told by Congress to do pages and pages of work trying to hit these terrible toxic hotspots in the United States. We have species that have gone extinct despite a law that promised that wouldn't happen. And we have 500 animals on the waiting list to be considered whether they should be protected. And as they wait, some become extinct. Now, many blame the agencies for these failures, and that's what we hear in the United States. The agencies are terrible, they're not doing their job, it's a deep state. But again, I want to argue a lot of the blame really rests in how we design the process, and in some ways, maybe intentionally at points, actually to fail. So now we're on to the big mistakes. Mistake number one. In the United States, we say we love public participation. We equate good regulation with very robust participation. And on paper, our laws look terrific. We say that the agency, when they implement rules, publishes a proposal. Anyone out there can comment. And if the agency doesn't take those comments seriously, those stakeholders can sue the agency for being arbitrary. It sounds great. So where's the mistake? In practice, in public health and environment, it turns out to participate in these very technical, complicated rules takes an enormous amount of resources. You need expertise, you need time, you need energy, sometimes more than a week per rule. As a result, the public interest groups and those representing the diffuse public drop out. They can't participate, and it becomes essentially a pay-to-play system in practice. So we have quite a few empirical studies now that are showing us what is actually going on in participation in these rules. This is one, and this is one I did, but they all seem to see the same thing. That is, first of all, in these rules, one at a time, the public interest representatives are not present in about half the rules. It's only industry and corporations. And when they are present, and this is the right bar chart over here, when the public interest is there, they are outnumbered by industry by about 30 or more to 1. What's even worse in terms of participatory imbalances in practice is the left side of the graphic. The white is industry. The little thing next to it is public interest. We see that it turns out that the agency publishes a proposal for public participation. Where does that proposal come from? Years of negotiating with stakeholders, and those negotiations don't have to be logged. They're totally informal, and guess what? We have more than 150 communications being logged per rule with industry, less than 1 communication with public interest per rule. So we see that the stakeholders that have the energy and the resources are the ones that are able to control what that proposal looks like before it goes into notice and comment. Our court system has decided also that the only comments that count for legal challenge are those that are in the record. So if an interest is adversely affected by an agency rule, but they didn't log in a comment, they are legally irrelevant. And from the agency's legal standpoint, it's much better for them to worry only about the comments they receive. Even though the agencies know they're heavily imbalanced, those are the only groups that actually can sue them in the United States. So the lesson from this design is if we are really serious that we want participation and we want it to be broad, we also have to develop legal processes that make sure it's meaningful participation by all affected interests. Otherwise, the system can actually backfire. So those with the most resources take over, and we don't hear from those that aren't able to participate. Now, it's my understanding in Brazil that you may have some similar dynamics going on from the FGV researchers I've talked about in the independent agencies. The environmental councils sound terrific to me, but it turns out, as I understand it from your researchers, that even there, participation is not subsidized. So those that represent indigenous communities and the public interest have to pay out of pocket. And so their ability to engage also is imbalanced. But whatever the case, it seems to me this is a problem that is going to lead to problems in implementation. Okay, our second big mistake. In the United States, the one thing we agree on very little about regulatory agencies right now, very polarized, but the one thing everybody agrees on is that our agencies should provide scientific expertise. They should be the ones to provide that detail to inform policymakers. And in providing expertise, we of course expect high professional scientists that are independent and objective. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, has reports that say that we want expert agencies that are independent from stakeholder and political oversight. Otherwise, the entire expertise systems collapse. And so to that end, in the United States, on paper, we hire wonderful scientists to staff the science. And Congress often says in its laws, we want those expert agencies to use the very best available science. Sounds good. Where's the mistake? In the United States, our agency scientists work completely under the control of the political officials. The political officials oversee whatever they decide. And so that means that when the scientific research is inconvenient or gets in the way of a preferred policy, they can simply change the facts, and nobody knows the difference. So in the United States, we have quite a few scandals. Not to say this always happens, or maybe that it mostly happens, but it sometimes happens that political officials will manipulate the scientific facts in ways that people are not aware of. So we find them editing reports, including numbers and sources that are cited in those reports before they go public. They actually bully field staff to change their findings out in the field. They terminate reports and projects that they don't like, and nobody knows that they even happened. And they can actually terminate staff. In the United States, our political officials also oversee our wonderful science advisory process. We bring in expert outside peers to preside over the agency science. Political officials are in charge of this system as well. So they can decide who is on the peer panels, as well as sometimes whether we even have them. So this is another empirical study. And so what we find, again, we see some abuses. We don't know how widespread it is, but we see presidents sometimes quite openly saying, I'm going to stack this expert panel because I believe this is the right answer. But this study was very interesting. They did an empirical study across presidents and found that ideologically and politically, the scientists that the Democrats hired were aligned with Democrats, and the scientists appointed, the scientists that Republicans put on the science advisory boards were aligned with Republicans. So the triangles are Republicans, and the circles are Democrats, statistically significant, I think at the 99th percent level. So there's no question that the political appointees are doing these decisions. And in the United States, it is all considered confidential records. We cannot know anything that goes on internally unless they decide to share it. And if a political official doesn't want to share these conversations they're having, it is completely black boxed. We have no idea. So the lesson here, if we're really serious about agency expertise and we really want science that's reliable and trustworthy, then ideally we provide our scientific staff with some independence. And if we don't think we can do that, at least we should require or allow the scientific staff to tell us when there have been political manipulations into that scientific record. Okay, last mistake. We expect the agencies to enforce and implement the laws. That's what Regulation Week is all about. They are big and important. And so Congress tells them to do things, and our president is supposed to faithfully execute those laws. So we rely on them. So what happened here? In practice, the agencies do get very direct assignments from Congress and sometimes from the president. But those assignments sometimes, perhaps often, come with many strings attached that actually limit the ability of the agency to finalize and finish that work. So, it looks like the agency and the statute is supposed to do these things, but when you go into the details and the fine print, you find one impediment after another, so the agency can't really do the enforcement or the implementation. To take an example on the enforcement side, we have a worker protection law that promises workers with a lot of text that they are entitled to safe workplaces. There's many problems with this statute, but just on the enforcement side, it turns out, first of all, the agency has a teeny budget, so they can't begin to enforce. I think it would take them 700 years to get to all the workplaces that are supposed to comply. Even worse, Congress has set caps on the penalties that can be charged. So when an employer commits a crime of intentionally violating the public health rules in ways that kill a worker and a worker dies, the penalties are so low that they're significantly less than the criminal sanctions for killing a wild burro in the United States. On the implementation side, the impediments are even more significant in some statutes and in some programs. Again, my favorite failure, chemical regulation, has probably the best examples here. So the way these impediments are usually invisible, snuck into the statutes, we can see the agency is told to do rules, but there's dozens of sub-steps they need to do before they can actually get that rule into place. You need to do this report, this analysis, that analysis. And it takes years and years, and the agency is bogged down with their tiny staff. We also see sometimes another trick is to fragment agency authority. So we have multiple agencies all supposed to do the same thing, or multiple levels of government supposed to do the same thing, again, in a way designed specifically to not succeed. In the case of chemical regulation and the implementation, so 50,000 chemicals to regulate, but the agency has a very small budget, a staff, it's gotten better, but still quite small. It turns out there's many, many barriers the agency has in statutes and laws to actually access information about chemical safety from the industry. So in a recent article I published with my colleague Tom McGarity, we found almost 24 impediments to the agency just to access information about the safety of the chemicals. Even though the agency has a little budget and very limited access to information or obstacles, we also see a very high level of proof that's required of them to be able to restrict chemicals, and many access points for stakeholders to challenge. So it's easy, essentially, to shut the agency down. And guess who gets the blame for chemical regulation failure? It's the agencies. It's not how we've designed the process through the political system. So despite all of these invisible, mostly invisible, what I call shackles on the agencies that literally keep them from doing the jobs that we set them out to do, I think in the United States we generally think that when these programs fail, it's the agency's fault and it has nothing to do with how we design the regulatory system. And more importantly, in the United States, as far as I know, there's really no inventory or accounting of these shackles. So we don't really know all the reasons that agencies can't do the work or all the things that we have planted to get in their way. At the same time, though, these constraints placed on agencies, we see in research, and we're doing actually a book in progress on this, they increase over time. More and more shackles are added, particularly when the agency is very successful at doing what it was set out to do, then more shackles come in, most of which are invisible, and it's a great deal for politicians because they can say the agency is failing and also please constituents, so they get sort of the best of both worlds, particularly since these are so subtle. So the lesson here, when the stakes are high, we are going to see the political branches click into place and impose all these invisible constraints that most of the public doesn't see on the ability of the agencies to actually do what they were supposed to be doing. The solution here, I think, is to ensure when we tell agencies what they are supposed to do, the rest of the public should know that they have the tools they need to do it, or at the very least, we should account for these various shackles so that the public has them and is visible, and we have greater political accountability. So in sum, I think the substance of the law is vitally important, and we'll be talking a lot about that. But I don't want us to lose sight of how we design the regulatory program, because I think a lot can collapse at that stage. The United States is a model in how to not do things, and hopefully Brazil is doing better than we are. But if not, or you're struggling, I hope you can learn something from the US mistakes, because I think there's a lot there to offer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wagner. Antes de introduzir o nosso próximo palestrante, eu queria pedir licença e fazer um agradecimento aqui direto ao professor Marcelo Mansur, que está ali no fundo, que coordenou todo o nosso painel de seguros na segunda-feira. Obrigado por estar aqui conosco, viu, Marcelo? Um grande abraço. Professor Donald Elliott is the Florence Hogwarts Professor of Law at Yale Law School. He is a leading academic scholar as well as a practitioner in the fields of administrative and environmental law. Professor Elliott is one of the most well-known, well-regarded environmental law professors in the United States. He has been on the Yale faculty since 1981. His latest book with Dan Ishti is Advanced Introduction to U.S. Environmental Law. Professor Sérgio Guerra has one. He has published several articles in the most prestigious journals. From 1989 to 1991, Professor Elliott served as Assistant Administrator and General Counsel of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. In 1993, he was named to be the first endowed chair environmental law and policy at any major American law school, the Julian and Virginia Cornell Chair in Environmental Law and Litigation at the Yale Law School. He was named one of the top 25 environmental attorneys in the United States by the National Law Journal. He earned both his BA summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa and his JD from Yale. Following graduation, he was a law clerk for Gerhard Gesell in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia and for Chief Judge David Bazelon of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. Professor Donald Elliott, you have the floor. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you very much. It's a wonderful introduction. My father would have been very proud, and my mother would have believed it. It's a great pleasure to be back in Rio. The last time I was in Rio, I asked my wife to marry me, so I have very fond memories of Rio, and there's an awful lot to talk about. I don't fundamentally disagree with Wendy Wagner's critique. Wendy's a former student of mine, and we're on the same page. I might express things a little bit more gently than Wendy does, but I do think that there are lots and lots of problems in the U.S. system, and I think it's people like Wendy that help us make things better. And I think paying attention to what isn't working well is a very important thing. But I think it's also, I was very impressed with the things that Professor Carlos had to say in forming the context. In particular, I think his point about the disconnect between national regulation and multinational corporations is really a fundamental one. And I think today it's very important that countries around the world learn from one another and coordinate their regulatory efforts. That said, I think successes are as important as failures. One of Leo Tolstoy, in his famous book Anna Karenina, begins by saying, all happy families are alike and all unhappy families are different. And I think the fundamental point that he's making is there's an infinite number of ways that things can go wrong. And what we need to do, I think, in law is an approach that's more commonly used in business schools, and that is to study successes and try and figure out why they're successful and try and duplicate successes. So despite the topic, I'm going to talk about both successes and failures in the U.S. system. So I'm really going to talk about three different topics. First, looking at the AIR program as a case study. I agree with Professor Wagner that our system for regulating chemicals is probably the weakest part of the environmental system. The AIR program is probably the best part of the system. So I think it's worth looking at that. Then I'm going to quickly talk about what I think are the 5 best things and the 5 worst things about U.S. environmental law, and I'll go through them rather quickly. And then at the end, I want to spend a little time talking about my vision for the future of environmental law and maybe what some of the unfinished business is that we need to address in the future. So the first is a study, a quick overview of the AIR program as a case study. This is based on an article I published in the Case Western Law Review in 2020. It's available on the internet, but I brought a couple copies with me. If anybody's interested, let me know. So despite many of the problems that are very real, the AIR program has made substantial progress in greatly reducing air pollution concentrations of the chemicals that are regulated in the United States. And this actually understates this chart understates the decreases because it only is 1980 to 2005. But you can see that with regard to the pollutants that are regulated, we've made very, very substantial decreases. And this has been done without really stifling economic growth, which I think is a big accomplishment, although the program has been very expensive. So you can see the measures of economic growth increasing at the top and the pollution decreasing at the bottom. So that's something positive. But, as Professor Wagner said, about 1/3 of the people in the United States still live in areas where the air is unhealthy to breathe. And this is after an effort that goes back to essentially 1970. So, you know, after 50 years, nobody would, I think, claim that we're entirely successful. Now, it is true that to some extent, our agency, EPA, has moved the goalposts in the sense that they've made some of the standards more stringent. But overall, it's still the fact that a large number of our population lives in areas where the air is unhealthy. That just shows you where some of those are. They tend to be concentrated in the more densely populated areas on the East Coast and West Coast. So another, I think, really major failure of our regulatory system is in dealing with climate change. I won't go into the details, but although the Clean Air Act identifies protecting climate, the 1970 Clean Air Act identifies protecting climate as one of its goals, and the United States in 1992 signed up on an international treaty called the Rio Treaty, negotiated here in Rio de Janeiro, committing us to reducing taking cost-effective measures against climate change. And our Supreme Court held in 2007 that EPA had authority to regulate greenhouse gases. Still, we don't have effective regulation of greenhouse gases in the United States. The Biden administration is making some headway, proposing substantial subsidies to try to encourage the use of electric vehicles, and proposing, but not yet implementing, it's still subject to judicial review, tailpipe standards for gasoline-powered vehicles that will be very difficult to meet. So the current program aspires to essentially replace gasoline-powered vehicles with electric vehicles. We'll see whether or not that happens. There are lots of people who think after the next election, depending on who wins, a lot of this may go away. So you'd certainly have to say one of the substantive failures after 50 years is we're not doing very much with regard to climate change. Part of the problem is that I agree with Professor Wagner again, that it has to do with the approach. Sociologist Robert Kagan called the approach to regulating the environment bureaucratic legalism. And I think in some ways Brazil and some other countries have copied bureaucratic legalism as an overall approach. It has a number of features, but one of them is that it is very slow and very expensive. It was adopted in part because it was the approach that the U.S. had used in the previous battle against racial discrimination in the United States quite successfully. So we sort of copied what we had been doing with regard to other problems. On the other hand, I think the evidence shows that quantitative standards on a facility-by-facility basis are the most enforceable worldwide. So if you look at the systems that actually are effective in reducing emissions, particularly from factories, they have the common feature of setting numerical standards as opposed to having broad generalities. There are many countries around the world that have very good or very high-sounding principles in theory, but unless they're translated into concrete requirements at the facility level, they're almost impossible to enforce. Okay, the problems with the bureaucratic legalism system have been set out in a wonderful article by Richard Stewart, who was a professor at NYU, recently died, and also in a wonderful report by the National Academy of Sciences called Air Quality Management in the United States. And the bureaucratic system for regulating is slow, expensive, complex, and legalistic. And you can say all those as many different times as you want, but it just has those features. I give a number of examples in my article assessing the AIR program. I'm just going to talk about two of them. It took us 25 years to ban lead in gasoline. And these are the steps along the way, even though the evidence was pretty conclusive about the adverse effects of lead in gasoline. And Japan banned it in 1980. It took us until it took us a long time, far longer than many other countries. Another example of the difficulty is the problem of interstate pollution. And I don't know whether this is more of a problem in the United States or more of a problem here. I really don't know. But a lot of the non-attainment that I showed you earlier along the East Coast or the West Coast comes from plants in the middle of the country that are releasing pollution that migrates for long distances and then causes problems in other states. We call this interstate air pollution. And EPA has been struggling with this problem for 25 years and is still struggling with the problem. It's attempted to regulate it in numerous times. I won't go through all of the details. They're set out in the article in Case Western. So the road that's not taken, the alternative to the approach of bureaucratic legalism, would have been what are called Pigouvian emission fees, after an English economist, A.G. Pigou, who basically proposed the way to control pollution is to impose a tax which compensates for the harm that the pollution is doing. That's called internalizing costs. We experimented with that when the Clean Air Act was enacted in 1990. One of the alternatives that was proposed by the Nixon administration was to enact the sulfur oxides tax. That was not done. But we did have a very successful acid rain trading program that was implemented under the 1990 amendments. And it basically, in a 10-year period, got more reductions in pollution than all of the other activities of EPA combined during that comparable period. And it did that with less than 0.5% of the EPA employees. So if any business was getting the overwhelming percentage of its profits from something that less than 0.5% of the employees were doing, they'd want to do more of that. And ironically, for a variety of reasons, we haven't gone down that road. We've continued with the bureaucratic legalism. I've been a proponent of using emissions fees since 1982. This is the first article I wrote with my colleague Bruce Ackerman. It was in the New York Times in 1982. So we've been struggling over whether or not we ought to use emissions fees since that time. I would mention, let me just go back, one of the advantages of emissions fees, which I think is particularly relevant for you in Brazil, is it's a way to raise a great deal of money that you can then use to fund efforts and fund your local pollution councils. The United States government collects over $100 billion a year in various fees from industry. And we have specific laws. We have a specific provision in the Clean Air Act of 1990, which I helped to get in there while I was at EPA, that allows the state and local agencies to charge fees for permitting the polluters and then use those fees to fund their efforts. And I understand from some of our colleagues here at FGV that that's a problem in Brazil. So emissions fees would be very useful, not simply as an incentive to reduce, but also a way to raise a great deal of money. And a number of agencies in the United States do this. We actually got in the 1990 amendments a particular section of the statute, Section 185, that gave EPA authority to use emission fees for major polluters in non-attainment areas, areas where they were still violating the national standards. And in essence, EPA didn't want to do it, and so they interpreted it out of existence. So the agency as a whole and the people who work there are very highly motivated. I think it's the best agency in government. But that said, they've been very skeptical about the economic incentive approach. My conclusions about the AIR program is that it's been successful but slow, and that it would be helpful to have economic incentives as well as command and control or bureaucratic legalism. I think the combination of the two, rather than a false argument about one or the other, would be very helpful. You can read this last quote about the acid rain program that was put in place by Congress in 1990. It reduced pollution more in one decade than all the other clean air command and control programs. It achieved those reductions at 2/3 of the cost to accomplish the reductions using the classical command and control regulatory system, and it only took about 75 EPA employees to run the program out of a total of 18,000 employees. So 75 employees got the same amount of reductions as the other 17,925. Okay, so quickly, the five best and five worst things about environmental law in the U.S. This comes from a lecture I did in Taiwan in 2010, and I'm delighted to say that although I've changed my views about a lot of things, I still agree with what I thought in 2010. So I'll go through these things real quickly, and I'll mention both the positive and negative. First, do is verifiable and enforceable facility-based standards, getting to actual limits on particular plants. For many years, the UK relied on general principles of law rather than having facility-specific standards. And a few years ago, they gave up with trying to regulate through the courts in that way and created an agency that would actually try to set individual facility standards. So I think that's one lesson of what works worldwide. I've already talked about the advantages of market-based cap and trade systems. I'm not in favor of just cap and trade systems, pollution rights systems, but rather using those on top of regulatory systems. One of the best things that we do, and a number of other countries around the world have adopted it, and I understand this may also be the case in Brazil, is the ability of citizens groups like those that Wendy described in order to sue the government to make sure that it keeps its promises. And that's written into our statutes, and it's one of the reasons that the system works to some degree, despite all the problems that Wendy talked about. So that's something I would recommend. Another feature, I think, of the U.S. system is keeping the tort system available in the background. And despite the problems with chemical regulation, one of the things that causes there to be very few chemicals that are in general circulation in the United States and not in general circulation in Europe, where Europe has a much more stringent regulatory system, is the threat of liability. So failures of a regulatory system can be backed up to some extent by having liability as a backup. And the last is using risk assessment to set priorities. So here are my don'ts. I agree with Wendy. We have much too high a burden of factual proof on the government. The government has to prove that something is hazardous rather than industry having to prove that something is safe before it releases large amounts of it into the environment. Professor Wagner mentioned PFAS. That was used in many products, and thousands of tons were released into the environment without any adequate study of what the long-term potential effects are, and we're now trying to fix that problem. And you'll see at the end of this presentation that that's one of the things that I think we really need to change. So it really shouldn't be a high burden of proof on the government to show something is hazardous. It should be a burden of proof should be on industry to show that something is relatively safe. I think that judicial review of scientific and technical decisions by non-expert judges, by judges that don't have a scientific background, has not really been worth the cost that it imposes, both in terms of striking down rules and in terms of long delays. I guess I'm in favor of judicial review, but I would be in favor of it through specialized courts. One of our states, Vermont, has specialized environmental courts, and I haven't really studied that, but I think that's the way to go. And some other countries in Europe, such as Germany and France, also have relatively expert courts to review administrative decisions rather than having these decisions be subject to judges who have dealt with a disclosure requirement in an SEC statement one day and deal with an EPA rule the next day. I think one of the big problems we've had is substance by substance regulation. The combination of 50,000 chemicals that Professor Wagner talked about. We regulate them one by one. That's gotten a little bit better since 2010. We now do a little bit of what's called read across, where we try to understand classes of chemicals and regulate chemicals by class rather than having to regulate each one and letting releases be accumulated in the environment until somebody can prove that that's hazardous. But I still think substance by substance regulation is a don't. Separate media programs, the air program, the water program, the waste program, the chemical program at EPA are all really separate rather than integrated. And I think the last one, and perhaps the most important one, is we've had ill-defined goals. And we have thousands of pages of statutes, but it's often really quite unclear what the purpose and what the goal is, and I'll talk about that in the next section. So the third and final section is what should we do from here? What should the environmental law of the 21st century look like? And this is based on an article that Dan Esty and I published in the NYU Environmental Law Journal in 2021. Unlike most countries, including Brazil, the U.S. does not have a constitutional right to a healthy environment. However, we do have a statutory right to a healthy environment, and it hasn't really been enforced. It hasn't really been the subject of litigation or enforcement, unlike some other provisions of the National Environmental Policy Act. I think the wrong turn in U.S. environmental law came with the Reagan Executive Order 12291 in 1981 that set up the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which is now headed by a former student of mine named Ricky Revesz from NYU, who I think will be very good in that role. But the real problem with that approach is it was an across-the-board approach. It wasn't really focused on the environmental area. It said all regulation ought to produce net social benefits. So in technical terms, it basically made the goal of all regulation to promote economic efficiency or to maximize aggregate social welfare versus guaranteeing that everyone has a healthy environment. And to me, that's inconsistent with the notion that we have a statutory right to a healthy environment, not just the statutory right to a healthy environment where it's economically efficient to promote a healthy environment, but a rights-based approach. And pollution is literally permitted in the United States if it's too costly to eliminate. So I do not believe that polluters should be allowed to continue to injure others simply because the costs of preventing the pollution are greater than the costs of the harm. And that's a fundamental part of U.S. policy. It's not a rights-based approach. It's an economic efficiency approach. And I think that's an important mistake to avoid. An example of another regulatory system, and I would agree with Wendy, who criticized OSHA and OSHA enforcement. I think it's a beautiful system on paper, but she's absolutely right. I've represented people in a number of OSHA cases, and the penalties are a very small fraction of what they are in other environmental areas, even for serious things like death. So it's one of those systems that's beautiful on paper, but it's not so great in terms of how it's actually enforced. But it does have three features which I think we ought to adopt more generally. The first is that employers have an obligation to eliminate hazards to the extent feasible. Not to the extent economically efficient, but to the extent that it's feasible not to expose workers. Secondly, employers have to compensate those workers and their families who are injured. That's usually done through state worker compensation laws, but it's nonetheless part of the system. And perhaps the most important part is that employers have an obligation to disclose the science to their employees for the risks that remain. So three elements. Number one, eliminate risk to the extent feasible. Number two, compensate those who are injured. And number three, disclose the risks to which people are exposed. And basically, that's the system that that Dan Esty and I argue about in our article argue for the system of the future in our article in the NYU Environmental Law Journal. I would also say that it does represent a recent trend. Since 1990, the three statutes that Congress has passed all really reject the economic approach and take a more absolutist approach. For example, the 2016 Lautenberg amendments to the Toxic Substance Control Act specifically exclude the consideration of so-called non-risk factors. So we see there to be a trend against the 1981 Reagan executive order in the Congress. So that's it. Just some citations. The AIR study, the AIR program is a case study, is a 2020 article in Case Western. 5 best and 5 worst things is in the Taiwan National Law Review, also available online. Environmental Law for the 21st Century is in the NYU Environmental Law Journal in 2021. And a critical summary of U.S. environmental law, not just the AIR program, but across the board, is this little book that Esty and I published a couple years ago. It's available on Amazon. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Elliott. Nós temos um pouco de tempo para perguntas, se tivermos. Alguém tem alguma pergunta específica que queira fazer? O microfone vai até vocês. Professor Sérgio Guerra.
Obrigado. Thank you, professors, for your presentation. I have a question for you both. We don't have in Brazil the Brazilian administrative state was inspired in the U.S. style, right? There is no question about that. But we don't have the position of the administrative law judge. Would you mind talk a little bit about the administrative law judge? What's the importance of the administrative law judge in the EPA decision?
Yeah, I will. There it is. I got it. So an administrative law judge is an agency employee who adjudicates cases inside the agency so that they never go to court. And this is a system that is very favorable to the agency. The agency wins overwhelmingly in those kinds of cases. Interestingly enough, it's currently being challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Jarsky versus SEC, which was argued about a week ago. And I would predict, having listened to the argument, that the court is going to say that at least some aspects of it are illegal because it denies the right to jury trial. And one of the most important purposes of the right to jury trial is to protect individuals against arbitrary actions by government. That's why it was created. And administrative law judges are less good to do that. They tend more to sympathize with the agency. So my prediction is that they won't eliminate administrative law judges overnight, but we're clearly going to see, I think, a trend to cut back on the extent to administrative law judges. Just to give you one concrete example, in the argument, Justice Kavanaugh was asked the counsel, does it really make any difference? And the counsel mentioned a number of procedural differences. I had a case a few years ago for a company that I won't name that was making a substance that was a hand sanitizer. And it used alcohol as the active ingredient. And EPA actually recommended alcohol as the safest active ingredient. And some of the employees of the company started telling their customers, well, you can use this stuff not just on your hands, but to clean off tables. Now, it turns out in the United States, a different agency regulates the substances that you can use to clean off tables. And so EPA prosecuted this company for what I would say is basically a technical violation. It was absolutely safe. They paid $5 million. So they paid a lot more in a administrative law judge proceeding in the agency than I think a jury would have awarded. So, you know, there are, Wendy tends to be, Professor Wagner tends rightly to be more concerned about the absence of appropriate regulation in some instances, but there are also instances of regulatory abuses that go too far in the other direction. And I think that we're going to see administrative law judges reined in to some extent by this Supreme Court case.
Oh, it's on? But the companies can't appeal to the courts.
That's right, but they appeal under, as you know, under a substantial evidence standard. So it's not really the same as a jury trial.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, Professor Elliott and Professor Wagner. I really liked the presentation. Thank you so much. And my question is the following. Professor Elliott commented that some of the initiatives of the Biden administration might be reversed very soon, depending on the next election. And I find that the effectiveness of regulation also depends on some level of stability and long-term goals, right? In Brazil, we talk a lot about insulating agencies from the oscillations of political programs and trying to find a good balance for what those long-term goals should be. So if you could comment on that. There is also obviously a democratic problem there we don't want agencies to not have any level of democratic control. So I think it's a really problematic problem, especially since polarization seems to be on the rise. And on the matter of environmental regulation specifically, there seems to be a lot of polarization and division between the parties in the US and also right now in Brazil. So can you comment on that? And if you could comment on both perspectives on how this relates to substantive matters and procedural matters and matters of governance? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Well, we have two kinds of agencies in the United States. We have so-called independent agencies where the heads of the agencies serve a fixed term and they cannot be fired by the president except for misconduct. And then we have other agencies that are part of the executive branch, and the head of the agency and the key leaders of the agency all serve at the pleasure of the president. So two kinds of agencies. I understand you also have that in Brazil. In the United States, like in Brazil, the environmental agency is not an independent agency. It is under the president, and it serves and there is substantial direction by the president. And I think that climate change in particular has been a very polarizing environmental issue in the United States, and that's one of the things that one of the reasons we've gotten so little done. It's interesting that Chuck Schumer, who is now the majority leader of the Senate, when he was an individual congressperson, proposed a bill to make EPA an independent agency. And I think that, you know, if I were king and I could make changes, I would probably make it an independent agency and give it more independence from the president, because I do think that as administrations come and go, that it makes it very difficult to deal with some of these long-term problems. The one thing that gives me hope is the most recent study I've seen says that over 50% of Republicans also support action on climate change in the United States, and overwhelmingly Democrats support it. So it may be that it won't go back and forth. But I agree with the premise of the question. I think if I could make a change, I would give EPA more independent authority, like some other agencies have. For example, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which regulates the harms from products, from consumer products, that's relatively independent. It has a certain number of Republican appointees, a certain number of Democrat appointees, and they serve for a fixed term. So I think it makes sense to have a single head of the Environmental Protection Agency, but I would have that person be appointed or confirmed for a fixed term of years, as we do with, say, the head of the Federal Reserve Bank.
Yeah, I think that would be a step in the right direction, but we see independent agencies like CPSC, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, also do very little when it comes to the toxins in products. So that's not a magic bullet. I think Lucas's question is great, and just to add to Don's answer, which is excellent, there's an empirical question about when we had President Trump, whose mission was to dismantle environmental regulation. Now that we have President Biden, how much of that dismantling actually accomplished, stuck? And how much did it delay us? And I'm not sure. So to dismantle rules in the United States, you have to go through the same process as to create rules. So we found out that the dismantling hit legal obstacles. So it didn't actually end up getting dismantled because the processes we had in place. So it's hard to know, but it could be that in truth, empirically, some of those fluctuations in administrations don't have the kind of dramatic effect that they are purported to politically.
Yeah, when you're finished.
Yeah.
Just to add something to that, I agree with that, and I think it was a testimony to the checks and balances in the U.S. system, that an overwhelming majority of the deregulatory effects of the Trump administration were set aside in court for not being properly supported. However, and this is the point I wanted to make, if the White House is not supportive, it really stops new initiatives. You know, you can't get a major new climate rule through the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs if the administration is strongly opposed to it. So while the Obama administration had a new rule on climate change that was eventually set aside by the Supreme Court, there were no new rules on climate change that were coming out under the Trump administration. So deregulatory effects, yes, they can be set aside in court, but who's in the White House really matters. And the periods of time when we've been relatively effective and expanded our regulation have been ones where there's been leadership from the top.
Eu vejo que nós temos outras perguntas, mas por conta do tempo e da organização do evento, nós agora vamos fazer um coffee break. First of all, I would like to thank you very much, Professor Wagner, Professor Elliott. It was wonderful to hear you. I think that we learned a lot, something that we can try to use and to improve in Brazil. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nós vamos fazer um break de exatos 20 minutos, ok? E já retornamos com a palestra do prefeito de Nova York.
you have a lot of...
Okay, very good. Thank you. Let's be in touch.
Yeah, have a coffee in Washington.
Oh, more than that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I'm waiting we can share a lot of food that I'm going to with if the acid already okay, the acid or each of these reasons why it was not coming to us so much.
So you're familiar with the concept of
That's it. Okay, so we have the federal water agency, which is doing some kind of federal voluntary rules. I saw why, because the federal government doesn't have jurisdiction over sanitation because it's considered
Looking forward, you're an independent agency, question
they still want to somehow account someone who appointed.
Well, and all of it's still, my big objection is it's all still black box, so we really don't know what's going on in independent agencies and non-independent agencies, but as long as it's all deliberative process, that's where we just go up.
I think that one thing that happens in Brazil still after 20 years of regulation is that we are still lost in regulation regarding the difference between an agency and an independent commission. So from time to time here, we hear the threat of that's the oversight body of the independent commissions.
Okay.
Because we need someone to review the regulatory impact assessment, we need someone to take a look
Under control.
to take a look at the procedure, but in fact what these people want is to put them under the institution. So far
Have you written this up?
no, because I'm always been afraid of losing the regulation and not exactly are the characteristics of an independent
But this is
commission.
well known, so I just love. That's pretty darn interesting. So we are working on a book on
then we have the opposite problem, that is, we don't have scientific information, and all the decisions are made by politicians. So we are kind of stuck in the proportionary phase. It's one black or white. Or we don't do anything because there's a risk, or, yeah.
You're just flying by the seat of your pants.
Yeah, so I would like to ask you if this is this interpretation I mean, because, okay, there's a problem with the site, but there is a cost to override the decision of the scientist or the opinion of the scientist. And I would like to ask you if it's a misinterpretation to say that having this problem is likely better than having no scientific information.
And the one thing I have to do so much, I mean, high altitude thing. So I did have a little thing up there, and I actually was going to emphasize it. So my point is that all of these internal sessions are confidential. So when they manipulate the science, all we get out of the back of it is the public manipulating the science. We have no idea that happened. Even the experts produce it, they say the experts produce it. So it's called ghostwriting, essentially, where politicians ghostwrite scientific reports. I don't think they do it in lots. So some of our scientific reports, maybe most of them are fabulous. But the way we have designed the process, we have no way to know what we can trust coming out of the agencies. So that's my problem. I totally agree. If the experts came out with their independent reports, fabulous, that's the world I want. And the political officials can say, I hate that result, or it's too expensive, or we don't want to do that, or your science is wrong, scientists, you're biased, and you stink. I'm happy with that conversation. We don't have that conversation. We just hear science as it goes through the political process coming out of science, and to me that's more dishonest. At least you think as politicians doing it all. We think the science, and I think the public does, I think a lot of lawyers probably what because they don't know how the process is actually designed.
I think one of our biggest problems is we can't put a price tag on it. So when we are deciding about some kind of regulation, we can compare the options, because I can't put a price tag on mine. And we have a moral problem, and we have such a difficulty to put everything in the same language to decide. And I think the United States is ahead. It's likely better with its cost-benefit analysis. It's not perfect, I know, but the impression we have from outside is that at least it's something to rationalize the process of the decision making. We have nothing.
So that is the problem. So we our record, it might not be honest. It might have manipulation, same with cost benefit. A lot of manipulations have not been documented. So my problem is we can do that. But I totally understand you're not even to the scientific record that isn't reliable, but at least it's better than nothing. That I think is essential. I mean, the benefit of a global program, presumably, is there are assessments out there that kind of influence, so they have some accountability based on what we know in the literature. But what bothers me is I think the United States is viewed as scientific reliable, but as great as it's not. And that is I am I wanted to be
the first premise of
and I
science
don't
is
like
that's
lies. And I don't like and that's persistent allowance. But I totally agree with
I don't want to but the last point I would like to ask is we don't have anything. We have environmental institute, but it's almost only for enforcement. So we have regulatory seems to lean toward any specific economic activity like mining or oil extraction. So there's no exactly on our side, but there's no centralization, no coordinating function for environmental decision. And one also present the presentation was, I think that EPA exercised its role effectively of giving some rational guidance to other agencies about the environment. Or yeah, just a funny story. We have a serious problem of disclosing information. But if you actively ask for information, then they give you almost everything. So once I was studying about the limitation on data packets for cell phones, and I asked for the equivalent of free information, and they gave me even the emails traded between the regulators.
Oh wow!
Yes. So that's crazy.
You would not get that in the U.S.
And I discovered that was my first assumption was that it was a regulatory capture case.
Yeah.
And then I discovered that no, it wasn't, because the emails traded between the regulators showed that they were blindsided by the industry. They discovered reading the newspaper with everyone else, and that blew up my hypothesis. But
well, that's bad for you.
yeah, but it was funny, huh?
But that's so cool about the West African. We're doing so many things to help, but because of the confidentiality and the way we set up the system, there's no transparency. And transparency was actually a great mistake. And our expertise is actually good.
I always said that. I used to work in Congress, and it depends on who your boss is. But I worked for Jeff Berkeley for Oregon, and then I was especially in Berkeley's office, I always said we could have a camera here the whole time.
Everybody would love it.
Yeah, not everyone would, but like our offices were so above board, and you know that's a bit of a hyperbole, but most people I know who worked in Congress, not now, came away less cynical than when they went in, because you see all of these people who are making half the money that they make in the private sector. They're there for usually the right reasons, trying really hard, at least on one side of the aisle. And in agencies where it's not as quite as divided, at least within the internal staff, more so. So I agree with that, because I think there's this like instinct, protective instinct that I totally get having worked in government. Anybody who's worked there gets. But you're right, in an age of like institutional distrust, it seems like they the wrong instincts now. Like
It is, and I think also when you manage an agency, you know, when you're at the top and you want to do well, you actually don't know what's going on. And you don't know the staff and that they are interacting with legislation. Nobody knows that. I mean, I had to know the grants to come up with those numbers because nobody, and it was really bad, but if they had transparency, then you could even have a point of so it's an internal. I mean, there's so many advantages. It's so terrible. It's so important.
worse.
Yeah, so.
I just want to say, we were supposed to have dinner on Wednesday. I mean, from Yale.
I wondered, I was like, where's
But apparently we're supposed to have dinner tonight. There is a dinner I'm told.
Yes,
So I am coming.
So please sit with us.
I would love to, because I met Donald for the first time today, even though we teach at Yale. But I'm clinical. We're in. That we haven't met.
Yes.
Yeah, it's good then. But
Actually, well, you're data privacy, right?
exactly, yeah. So
Oh, I would love to.
yeah.
And it's so cool you're down here learning all this.
It was amazing. I taught a short course here on information privacy law that was very similar to kind of the way you rank your presentations. It was sort of like lessons and challenges for the national case study. I found out that the Brazilians, of course, were really interested in how our private litigation system works as they do it. And they have a version of class action, like us, which are like similar in some ways and very, very different from others. Like private litigants cannot initiate class actions here, generally speaking. You have to be like a qualified organization. But because they do that, you don't get the same judicial gatekeeping we have, where like there's such a terror that the wrong person is leading the litigation.
So it has its benefits.
Exactly. So we tried to talk about that, and then I gave a standalone lecture to some graduate students in the 7th course that was exactly on the mention like complementary private litigation public for education. And like I didn't realize I was as interested in it as I was not. I don't think of myself as an admin person, as a procedure and tech person. But Natasha here was talking about how like Brazil, Cipro, and the red people don't talk to each other. I think that's kind of true in the U.S. sometimes
It
too.
is. I think the environment though.
It's much better. Much better.
So we're not sitting with people, and I disagree with her. I think scale.
Oh, but that is like the example of where managing passports are like a disaster, right? And these days, right?
Well, yeah, they can't do causation. So.
Do you know Liz Birch's work at all? She's very cool. I don't know if she had her speak to the Georgia, but she writes on multi-district litigation.
I was at a conference with her. Yeah.
So I work. It was interesting. There was a Enviro stuff, and I said we have this thing in common about like how it's the diffuse public, right? It's like little harms that aggregate. Brazil actually has a concept of diffuse rights, which we have like a special procedural vehicle, which we don't have. Not everyone likes it. Some people think that it's like, there's this formalist division between like diffuse rights versus homogeneous rights, and kind of like our Article 3 nonsense. But at least there's this like acknowledgement in law that such a thing exists, whereas like reading Article 3 now is different when Enviro cases, literally Enviro cases and data stuff. Yeah, sorry to interrupt because you guys are.
No, and please, I hope I will.
We'll continue with dinner.
I will.
No, rest my case.
Are you about
Sorry?
Yeah, no,
Music.
I'll tell you, I'm to know that, again, as an applicant,
we love to have
It's an amazing place.
it's an amazing
I'm not
place.
an environmental law professor. I'm teaching the law professor.
No way.
Yeah.
You sound like a regulatory nerd.
No, I studied regulatory theory, but
Clearly.
today I'm teaching justice. The concept of justice for the undergraduate
Oh
students.
my God.
So we do have classes about environmental.
I've had.
Yeah. problems across generations.
Do you spend any time with Michael Walzer in your course? Yeah, I think he's who I use in my PhD section.
But I would like you to ask you some.
Yes. So, and I know that there's a difference between
Yeah, their population is not exactly.
And I also like the science lab and the equation science. I'm also from
Sure. Right, and I trained in science too. But my problem is that the norms of science. They violate.
Yeah. All those, but in Brazil, they don't find anything, so we don't.
In the U.S., we learn how to learn process. None of those norms are in the process. But the private commission, I bet, what I understand,
Yeah, we're not going to do preliminaries. You're just going to, you can, or I can just start. I don't even, unless you want to, I'm going to tell people. Okay. Press conference style.
You like that? That's what you.
See?
The air you breathe.
This is what I'm used to. You're going to tell me when you have enough people.
Okay.
And where's the water? Oh, here it is. Okay.
You need water here. No, your water is this one.
This one? Okay. Yes, there's also, you'll appreciate this. In the United States, we don't ever no, seriously, because we should be getting away from them. So, look at this. No, you're right. It's crazy.
Can I just say?
You can say whatever you want.
Okay.
When you have the people there.
Yeah. Oh, I'm going to speak in Portuguese. And then we can. 2 days?
2 days.
Yeah.
Not at all, yep. Perfect.
Let me ask, Professor. Bom, daremos continuidade ao nosso último dia de evento e teremos agora o grande privilégio e prazer de ouvir o Bill de Blasio. Como vocês podem ver, nós tínhamos preparado aqui o palco, né, para fazer um debate tradicional, mas como eu tinha mencionado anteriormente, o Bill de Blasio não é muito chegado às formalidades, prefere fazer press conference style. Então, eu vou passar a palavra para ele. E, mais uma vez, quando encerrar o talk inicial dele, encorajo todos a fazerem perguntas, a trazerem questões. Eu falei com ele que as pessoas aqui, maioria dessa plateia, certamente adora Nova York e vai querer certamente ouvir dele muitos aspectos, desde como é morar em Nova York até como é ser prefeito de Nova York. Então, eu encorajo todos a trazerem suas perguntas. Ele vai estar com o aparelho aqui, caso queiram trazer as perguntas em português, sintam-se totalmente à vontade. Então, Mayor Bill de Blasio.
Thank you, Pericles. I want to thank everyone at FGV for this opportunity to be with you. It's a very exciting opportunity to join you. I have such admiration for the people of Brazil and for Brazil's increasingly important place in the world. So for me, this is a real honor to join you. Now, as Pericles said, I'm going to have this device ready for when I finish my remarks and I open it up. So you're all going to get to be New Yorkers, which means, I used to say to people, they'd ask me what it was like to be mayor of New York City, and I would say I represent 9 million highly opinionated people. So you can now join that tradition. And after I talk, if you want to ask a question, well, again, whether in English and Portuguese, if you have an opinion, if you have a question, whether it's about the topic of regulation or whether it's about anything else, New York or the American political situation or whatever, I am used to taking questions on all topics. And I fear no question. So, with that, I'm going to start the timer, because the one thing that's true is you've got to be careful with anybody who is in politics, because we talk too long. So we're going to try to keep this to about 20 minutes. And I want to talk to you about the topic that's become most important to me, which is artificial intelligence. And it is not because I am a technologist. I'm the farthest thing from a technologist. It's because as a leader, you become accustomed to looking at what's happening to your people and what they need and where our society is going, and you try to orient your energy and your time to where the need is greatest. I want to predict to everyone right here that even though there are massive issues right before us in Brazil and the United States, issues of income inequality and climate change and huge structural issues that we need to address, the issues our colleagues talked about earlier in terms of the environment, I think artificial intelligence is very, very quickly going to overtake all these issues. And I think it's hard for most of us to understand the magnitude of what we're about to face. But I put it this way in the context of the United States of America. We're talking potentially not just millions of jobs that will be lost to automation and artificial intelligence in a matter of only years, perhaps even just in this decade. In short order, we could be talking about tens of millions of jobs. I don't say that to be alarmist. I say it to orient us to the fact that we're dealing with something unlike any previous technological development. The speed, the intensity, the totality, even in comparison to an issue as fundamental as climate change, or issues historically crucial like the development of nuclear weapons and nuclear power, all of which are huge, seismic, global issues. Even in comparison to them, artificial intelligence can and will reach into literally every facet of human life globally, daily. And we, at this moment, we the people, do not have control of the situation. It's not even close. And that's what I want to talk about, how we have to understand decisions are being made about us, without us, on a very large scale, and that's a very dangerous situation. And it does not have to be this way, and we actually cannot tolerate the continuance of this situation. I'll give you a simple story. And this is an example of how decisions are made every single day about artificial intelligence, almost mindlessly, almost without hesitation or any attempt to think through the ramifications. Now, this is maybe 5 or 6 years ago when I'm in office as mayor of New York City. I will tell you I was not particularly focused on artificial intelligence at that point. I was focused on all the other issues I mentioned. And a group of officials came to me from my government. And they said, we have a great idea. There was an industrial space in Brooklyn called the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It's a classic industrial location. It was part of a major part of the World War II production effort that helped the United States to play the role it did in that war. Now a modern industrial facility. They said, these officials said to me, why don't we allow experimentation with autonomous vehicles in this space? It's a large space. Thousands of people work there. They said, let's bring autonomous vehicles in. We'll be part of the modern approach. We will be part of learning what this can mean for our society. New York City will be on the cutting edge where we belong. And it was presented in a kind of classically American, huge, energetic optimism that technology, without question, is part of the solution. And I said, what about the danger it would create to the people who work there? Autonomous vehicles are absolutely unproven. We've seen even recently in San Francisco and other parts of the United States, people killed, unfortunately, by autonomous vehicles. I said, what about the danger of the people who work there? What about the fact that if we participate in the growth of this industry, we are complicit in the changes that will come with it, including potentially a huge loss of jobs for drivers, truck drivers, taxi drivers, you name it. Is that something we want to be part of? Have we thought that through? Or are we just saying yes because it's convenient? And one thing I'll always give the technologists, particularly those who come from Silicon Valley in California, is that they speak with a religious fervor. They could be evangelists. They will literally tell you that technology will solve all your problems, which there's no historical proof of whatsoever. We can all, I think, a room of intelligent people such as here in Rio can say technology both helps and hurts us each and every time. And our job is to try to make that a better balance. But the notion that technology implicitly unto itself just makes our lives better is insane. It's incredibly unsophisticated. And yet, that's what we hear constantly. And the second thing we hear from the technologists, particularly the most powerful, the wealthiest, those from the large tech companies, is don't worry about this issue. It's so complicated, you can't understand it. We understand it, so let us make the decisions. What could be more profoundly undemocratic than a group of elites looking you in the eye and telling you you don't understand, they are better than you, so let them make the decisions because of their greatness compared to your smallness and lack of sophistication. That is effectively, in nicer words, what we are told every day in the debate on artificial intelligence. I was very honored just a few days ago to help organize a conference at Harvard University of people who are very critically minded about artificial intelligence, who are asking tough questions. We brought together elected officials and labor leaders and academics, and people are saying, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. And one of them was a Congress member from California, Ted Lieu, who actually trained in computer science. And he got up in front of the audience, he said, every time you hear that we're not capable to make decisions about our own lives, he said, let me give you an example. I'm a member of Congress. I can't tell you how an airplane works. I can't tell you if you're on a Boeing 787 how the mechanics of that plane work. I don't understand the technology, and yet I have to vote to decide what the rules will be for air safety in the United States of America. His point was simple. For generations, leaders have made decisions on even the most complex technological issues based on human values, based on the priorities of society, not based on the notion that every leader somehow had to be perfectly trained in all areas of technology in order to have a viewpoint or the ability to discern what was good for the people. So, the example I gave with the autonomous vehicles also points out a fascinating reality. And it's a reality of class, of economic class. It's a reality of the skew in income inequality, which has worsened certainly in the United States. It's a profound problem, I know, in Brazil and much of the world. The notion that somehow the human reality of working people doesn't matter. That no matter how many millions of people might lose their jobs, these actions to favor artificial intelligence are being done in the name of progress. And that, in fact, the human element is not overly important in how our future will be lived, which again defies every understanding we've had throughout human history. That in the name of efficiency, we should cut out that troublesome part of the equation, which is humanity. Machines are so much more efficient, let them do the work. There is no serious discussion, certainly in the United States, of how working people would be compensated economically. What would their lives look like? How would they make a living? What would be their sense of purpose? Would any plan to retrain them or compensate them be reliable and believable? Would it be sustainable? Who would we trust in that equation? These discussions aren't even beginning yet. But the forward march of the technology is occurring with no rule or regulation whatsoever. And I want you just to dwell on this. You know, I listened to my colleagues talk about the imperfections of regulation in terms of environmental law, and I felt a warm nostalgia because at least they have laws that they're talking about when it comes to the environment. Even Wendy's concern about the problems in terms of the regulation of chemicals, I look at that and I say, congratulations, there are some regulations. Even if they're being ignored, they exist. With artificial intelligence, the magnitude of which I've already indicated, there is literally no governing law or regulation or policy in the United States of America. And that's true of most nations of the world. I want to express profound gratitude to the European Union. And we had Brando Benefei from Italy, who's the lead sponsor of the European Union legislation, which is hopefully going to be passed in a matter of weeks, which is a substantial, muscular attempt to regulate artificial intelligence. And for everyone out there, including my American colleagues, who enjoy regulation that comes with some consequence, what we call in English teeth, some real impact if the regulation is violated, the European Union does not just levy the historic, traditional fines of thousands or tens of thousands of euros. The European Union instead, for the violation of this law, has proposed fines as a percentage of global profits for the big technology companies who are the #1 subjects of this law. Now, I mentioned the ideological fervor, the religious fervor of our friends in Silicon Valley, the technologists. Well, I'll tell you something they care about even more than their theories of technology, which is money. They are the most capitalist of capitalists. When you start talking about the potential of taking away a certain percentage of their global profit, this is when you start to get their full attention. So in the vein of always trying to find hope in every equation, and it's always there, the fact that as important a part of the globe as the European Union, 27 nations that effectively have to agree for something like this to happen, the fact that they're on the verge of creating the first true regulation of AI, and it comes with powerful consequences, is something that should encourage all of us. It will not be easy, and it will take too long to implement, I'm sure. I don't see it as an end point. I emphasize, I see it as a beginning. I think in terms of everything we discuss with regulation, we need to understand that each step forward, each act of progress is never an end point. It is either the beginning of creating an actual process of change with implementation, with consequence, or it is simply a door opener to a higher level of action. And so the fact that the European Union is acting gives me tremendous hope. I don't have that hope today about the United States of America. I'm happy President Biden has issued an executive order on AI just a few weeks ago. It was a strong beginning, but it doesn't have sufficient enforceability. I'm happy that our Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, is having hearings and gatherings on artificial intelligence, but I have no illusion that that will turn into substantial policy in the short term. So the other point I'd like to make is when a door seems closed, let's say at this moment the notion of muscular policymaking and regulation in the United States of America on artificial intelligence, that door seems closed today. But that is not the end of the discussion. When that happens, and it happens all the time on a host of issues, the power and the opportunity devolves to the regional level, the state level, the local level, the municipal level. But I think what has not been recognized sufficiently is that over the last few decades, more and more the actual opportunity for innovation, for strong policy making, for policy making that reflects the will of the people and the needs of the people, for progressive ideas, they come from the grassroots up. One of the greatest examples I can give you, and it's something I feel very proud of as an American, we were so far behind on the question of climate change until legislation was passed by our Congress in the last session, for strange reasons called the Inflation Reduction Act, but in truth, the most substantial legislation in the history of the United States to address the climate crisis. Why did that happen? It happened precisely because grassroots activists, people from social movements, pushed elected officials for years, even decades, to do something about climate when most of the political class wasn't listening, and when most of the business class was denying the reality of climate change. Local leaders, most notably the state of California, in defiance of the national government, created their own laws. They said if the national government is not functioning and protecting us, we have to protect ourselves. Their laws became a basis for the possibilities of national decision-making. You would think it's the other way around. National government deals with the big global crises, and then the localities receive the benefit. No, that's not what's happening. It's not just the United States or Brazil, it's all over the world. The failure of national governments, the polarization, the unwillingness to address tough issues has resulted in the reality that the action, the possibility is at the local level. And in the United States context, another point which really I think has to be honored and recognized, that a candidate ran for President of the United States twice, Bernie Sanders, calling himself a democratic socialist, which to American ears is very unusual. gained an immense amount of support, and working with other great leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, created the notion of the Green New Deal. And then some of us, in places like New York City, adopted the Green New Deal as our own, even though our national government was not acting. But all of that put upward pressure. And the reason Bernie Sanders was able to do that was millions and millions of Americans donated to him, volunteered for him, voted for him. None of the most substantial work came from the top down. That is not to say there weren't allies in the federal government. In fact, this is something I think is always true, and you find this in the regulatory world in general. If there's enough political action, you will find people inside government who share the desire to do something substantial in the public interest. They rarely have support. They rarely have, as we say in English, wind in their sails. But if you give them that groundswell, you will find those allies, sometimes quiet allies, who can do so much to help us take the next step. So, I'm sticking to my time limit, Pericles. What I would say, bringing this all together, and I think what I'm saying is true about artificial intelligence, it's true about climate, it's true about income inequality, it's true about a host of issues. We need to re-empower ourselves. We need to recognize that the world we were told was the reality, that's not the reality. The decisions now being made of the greatest consequence, arguably in human history, are being made in a thoroughly undemocratic manner, even in places that are officially democracies. That is an unacceptable state of affairs, and yet at the same time we see a growth of people's power, the ability of people to organize and share information locally and globally in a way that we've never seen before in human history either. And this is where technology has become our friend because it allows us to communicate and organize. But we have to see ourselves as actors in the drama. We have to take back agency. It is not going to be given to us. There's a powerful and essential quote in American political history. One of the most important things to remember, it's from Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist leader and former slave, who said, "Power grants nothing without a demand." I'll say it again. Power grants nothing without a demand. The demand has to come from the local level. It's the only place. And slowly but surely make its way to the national level here in the United States and around the world. And that demand has to be simple. Artificial intelligence must be developed for the people, not for the big tech companies, not for the few, not for the profit margins, but for the people. There is potential great good that we could find in artificial intelligence. I'm not here to tell you it is irredeemable, but not the way things are now. We cannot get the good, and we will receive too much of the bad unless this becomes a matter for true democratic debate and decision-making and governance and regulation. If it is to be, as I believe, the most important issue facing humanity, then it should be the issue that also reflects our democratic values in action. Thank you.
Bom, vamos abrir aqui o palco para quem quiser fazer pergunta.
Before anything, I'd like to thank you so much for your inspiring lecture. I'm a professor here at FGV, and I was also part of the commission of jurists who helped draft the AI bill here in Brazil. So this subject is something that has been heavily discussed here also in Brazil. So I'd like to ask you about the use of artificial intelligence in public security. I know that in New York you've had recent discussions with regards to initiatives like the DigiDog robot and also about autonomous lethal weapons, which is something that in your government you've been discussing in higher levels in terms of human decision, human supervision, should it be included as a mandatory obligation? And the second question would be, how can you act upon this subject in terms of your state. What could be done at a lower level of legislation? Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Well, I think the first question, can you hear me okay? Okay, good. I think the first question very effectively leads to the second. So in New York State and New York City, the topic has been, how do we end the use of AI in employment decision-making in a discriminatory fashion? And we passed a law in New York City to address the fact, remember, everything in artificial intelligence is the accumulation of human knowledge that's been fed into the system, and that knowledge is inherently racially biased, gender biased, go down the list. It reflects all of the problems of the current status quo in the world. So that's the last set of inputs you should want making decisions about employment. In New York, we've passed laws to reduce the use and to make public the use of those algorithms. There's more to do, but that's one example. In New York, we passed a law to create more oversight over police use of artificial intelligence and surveillance, and more of a public disclosure of what that use was and for what reason, and the ability of the public to monitor and elected officials to monitor and make adjustments accordingly. The issue of surveillance is one that is deeply felt throughout the world of democratic nations. And I'll reference that in a moment because I think it is one of the areas where there's greatest opportunity to organize people together on these issues. So I think the focus so far has been on reducing the discriminatory impact and the surveillance impact. No problem. I thought there was something. Okay. Can you hear me now? See, as a New Yorker, I'm used to being very loud anyway, so it didn't make a lot of difference. But the bigger issues, to me, are about the overall control of artificial intelligence systems. Because right now, there's no governing mechanism for ensuring the systems are safe and for having a public insight into them. So, for example, I think this was referenced in different ways earlier. If a new drug is to be introduced in the United States, it has to go through a thorough process with our Food and Drug Administration. Why don't we have that for artificial intelligence, which is arguably much more of an issue, and I don't even have to say arguably, it just is. And that's one of the interesting proposals. Could you do that not only on a national level, could you do that on a state level? State of California, State Senator Scott Wiener has introduced a piece of legislation that to some extent mirrors the European Union legislation that would have California separately as a state demand the same kind of transparency from the big tech companies into what they're doing, what their safety tests have been of their systems, a full disclosure of the work they're doing to give the government the ability to act if they see an unsafe development. And I think that's one of the most hopeful examples. I also think we have to recognize that states and localities have tools that are not yet being used. The number one way to confront big tech after the people's voice and the mobilization and the organization of people, the other way the government can confront big tech is money. Because all of big tech has a tremendous economic interest in all levels of government. Rio de Janeiro is a very large jurisdiction. Brazil is a huge country, 9th largest economy in the world. I guarantee you the big tech companies worry every day about anything that would disrupt the profit-making they make through their government contracts. Those contracts are where we have a particular entry point. The purchasing power of government at all levels, the investments of pension funds. This is a hugely important area that gets essentially no media coverage. Public pension funds around the world account for trillions of dollars of investment. Now, you might say Silicon Valley doesn't need our money. Ostensibly, that's true, but they are still sensitive to anything, as we see with the fossil fuel divestment effort around the world. Anything that undermines the core economics is helpful to create accountability and to create concession from the companies. Most governments, most institutions, foundations, universities, nonprofits, around the world are not yet fully taking account of their own purchasing power and their pension fund investments as tools for, if not political action, tools for reform. So these are all examples of what any state or locality anywhere in the world could do, or even public institutions or non-private institutions of different types could do. Do you want to call on people, or do you want me to? Oh, press conference. We're doing a press conference. Okay, I'm going to pretend you are all the New York City media. But your questions have to be nastier and more arrogant. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I teach a lot of technology here, and I appreciate particularly your point about the lack of teeth of some laws regulating artificial intelligence and the importance of having teeth. So to be provocative, I think that I would see the space for local initiatives more like in the back, because the government, the federal government will need to set the guardrails, and then local initiative will need to intervene when either there is a lack of action, like as you mentioned in the case of California, with privacy law, or when they want to go beyond, like it happened with San Francisco and the ban on facial recognition, when they want to go beyond, like what's the general level at the federal level. But I would be curious to hear your position on laws and initiatives that create a platform for innovation through regulatory sandboxes. So like frameworks that allow, like maybe the case of driverless cars that you mentioned, but also in a broader sense, that allow experimentation where you work closely with the innovators from the design to the beta stage in order to prevent problems down the line and maybe direct the innovations towards what is beneficial for society.
I thought because you were provocative, maybe you were acting like a New Yorker, but then when you got to the phrase regulatory sandbox, I found that way too gentle. And I'm sure the idea could be pertinent. I would caution. I think right now we have a sandbox for sure vis-a-vis big tech, but they are playing with all the toys alone, and government is not really there with them, comparing notes and shaping innovation and figuring out guardrails. I hate to be so easy and topical, but I will. The great noble experiment was OpenAI, and there was a board of independent, reform-minded members who would keep an eye on the developments at OpenAI and were empowered to make sure that OpenAI worked in the public interest. And the moment that board said, you know what, we think OpenAI has gone astray, we think it's not fulfilling its mission and its mandate, it's not working in the public interest, the moment they took action, they were fired. And that's happened with the oversight board of other big tech companies as well. So let's not kid ourselves. These are, God bless them all, but these are not noble actors. I would say to you the point about national level versus regional, state, municipal. Look, if you come with me to Brasilia right now and we can convince the president and your Congress that they all want to immediately pass a strong law on AI, then I'd say, of course, put your energy there. But the model in much of the world is the national level is where we find the most resistance to action. Again, on climate, on income inequality, on a host of issues, but certainly on AI, most national governments are not distinguishing themselves. So my point is only to say, rather than we watch as our fate is determined in a very dangerous manner, and I'll say it humanly, to all of you in the intellectual class, it's not just truck drivers, my friends. I'm going to make it personal and visceral. All of your jobs are in danger as well. I literally have had people in business telling me how they're preparing to fire lawyers or writers or researchers because the AI can do it more quickly, more cheaply. I would like people to feel a personal investment in this issue, not in a greedy sense or a parochial sense, but in a sense of that's not fair to you, it's not fair to the person who drives the truck, it's not fair to our democracy. By the way, you do things the AI can't do, but yes, you probably do cost more, and you're complicated. You get sick sometimes. You have opinions. Oh my God, who would allow that? So it comes down to, do we value humanity? Do we value our humanity? Do we think we actually, as humans, should come first, more than some god of efficiency and profit? If we do, then we have to locate the point of action wherever it exists. And if it exists at the national level, ideally, of course. Should we constantly demand that? Yes, please. But when there isn't action, that doesn't mean there's not another venue to start the process of change. Who's got the microphone? Where did it go? There. Wave at me.
Oi.
There you go.
I would like to ask a question in Portuguese. So
Okay, I am ready.
Boa tarde, eu me chamo Luísa. A minha pesquisa é mais na área de gestão de riscos de desastres. Nova York e o Rio de Janeiro têm algumas questões similares no sentido de inundações, alagamentos, ondas de calor. Eu queria ouvir um pouco mais de você sobre o nível de ação local da cidade de Nova York com esses temas.
I'll use colloquial English and say on the question of climate impact and rising sea levels and the impact particularly on cities like New York City and Rio de Janeiro, we are screwed. So that is my official government report to all of you. Now, what we have to do, look, the first thing to do, of course, is to address the climate crisis. And I don't mean that simplistically. We have to do more than one thing. There's the famous English language phrase, we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. So we have to address the climate crisis in any way we can because it's the root problem and it can be addressed. And there's actually really substantial progress on the national and business level, I should say the government and the business level. And again, not national, not enough, but on the government and business level in general, we've seen actually versions of progress in different parts of the world. We need to see a lot more. But the first question I would have, and I had this in New York City, what could we do to stop contributing as much to the emissions? In our case, we retrofitted all our public buildings. We moved our vehicle fleet to electric vehicles. We changed our energy source for our city government, which is a huge government, 400,000 employees, a very big government. We changed that to all renewable electricity. We demanded that private buildings, large private buildings, which are much more of the emissions problem than is recognized, that they were mandated to retrofit at their own cost. By the way, they make the money back because they save on energy costs eventually. We banned the use of fossil fuel energy generation on site in major buildings to get people, to wean people off it. So I think there are localities all over the world that can do these kind of actions to contribute. And again, and institutions, every institution of society should be trying to figure out what it can do, even if it's a small contribution, to reduce their emissions. But the immediate physical threat, in terms of rising sea level in particular, can it be met perfectly and ideally? No. But can we do something? Yes. There are actual barriers that including flexible barriers that can be brought up in times of storm surge that we've put in New York City have had a good effect. You can change your building codes. You can make sure that the most sensitive mechanical elements of a building, the energy systems, the heat systems, et cetera, are moved out of basements into higher levels as you build new buildings, as you retrofit buildings. There are a number of things you can do to soften the blow. And of course, arguably, to ensure there should be areas where there's no more building going forward. If you do those things, and if we're aggressive enough on reducing emissions, we might hit a balance point where we don't have the worst impacts that we fear for the end of this century. But I would finish by saying just a sort of an existential formulation. Do I think any of these things are perfect solutions? Absolutely not. But I think we have an obligation to try all of them, to just find the ones we can actually move on and not kind of wring our hands at what we don't have or what may or may not work, but act. And one thing I said, I was at the conference at Harvard recently, I do think one of the challenges in academia is there's a hyper concern, understandably, for the situation of the world, but sometimes it becomes a conversational circle instead of saying, how do we take this concern and bring it out to people and bring it out to a point of action? Because any action is better than nothing. Who's got the microphone? There you are.
Hi.
Which language?
English.
Okay.
My name is Vivian. I am from FGV project. I'm an economist. I'm not a lawyer. So
You're innocent.
Yeah, I'm innocent. So I'm going to ask you a question that's not about law, but I think that the artificial intelligence, the problem that the governments have is that if you want to make everybody go there and ask about a regulation or law, people normally make this using intelligence, artificial intelligence. They use the social...
Right. They use an iPhone.
An iPhone, yes.
Yes, there's artificial intelligence here.
Yes, and that's difficult.
But this is the nice kind. No, she wasn't saying anything bad about you.
And I think that this is the difficult, because how to make people be together to make this pressure that you say to the public people, and if to be together we use this. And here in Brazil, and I think that United States also, the problem is if you, that is a politic, make a rule, everybody in the social media, the first thing that appears is this politic wants to make a regulation.
Right.
Don't want you to say what you want. And everybody goes to the streets that in the side of the artificial intelligence. So I understand that when you say about the money, but how can you think that we can go out of this?
It's a good question. It really is. Look, I think there's 2 or 3 elements that I think will be the essence of why we can build social movements. And I want to say, and I said this at the Harvard conference, it's strange that there's not a strong global social movement already on artificial intelligence. There's an extraordinary global movement on climate, and we could name certainly other areas as well where we've seen a really amazing mobilization around the globe on key issues. This one, there's a disconnect that has to be solved. But again, it will be solved, just like the growth of the climate movement, piece by piece. It starts in one country or one city and builds and spreads, and we have to go through that trajectory. 3 areas I think will be hopeful because they are so palpable. I think the issue of employment, where you have the possibility of building a very broad coalition, because the negative impacts of AI on employment will reach upper middle class people, working people, poor people across the board. So you have an opportunity for a broad movement, broad coalition. It's tangible. People are going to start to see job loss on a big scale. I'm not happy about it, but they're going to see it, they're going to feel it. You have the possibility of uniting with the labor movement, which is strong in many parts of the world. That piece, I think, is the most clear and distinct. I think a second piece is about the reality of the corporate structure. I think certainly the polling in the United States of America says that Americans are still a little too in love with technology as an idea, but they are not in love with the big tech companies. They feel their data has been stolen, their children have been negatively influenced. At this point, the big tech companies are less popular than the government. There is an opportunity there to cast this in an us versus them reality of who is making the decisions for you and what are their interests versus your interests. And I think it's not a hard argument to make. And then lastly, and by the way, I'm a progressive and I believe in populism. There's a whole history. Sometimes we say populism and people associate that currently with the right wing. Populism as an idea goes back, a century or more, and often was a progressive tool, a reform tool. I think we need to reclaim it. This is an example, that kind of, the us versus them is honest here. The last point is surveillance and privacy. This is an example I give from the United States, and it's an extremely powerful one. You may remember, for everyone who followed the events after the tragedy of 9/11 in New York City, a piece of legislation was passed in the American Congress called the Patriot Act. And it was to address terrorism, but it was very stringent, and many Americans felt it was starting to interfere with constitutional rights and liberties. It came up for renewal. And interestingly, the farthest left elements of the United States Senate and the farthest right elements of the United States Senate, some of whom were libertarian in their worldview, united to force a series of reforms, because both left and right feared the reduction of constitutional rights. Now, is that going to happen every day? Of course not. But the point is, I do believe one thing that unites many people in democracies is they do not like a surveillance state. They do not like surveillance in the workplace. This is a very big emerging factor, where people, their computers are looking back at them. As we say in English, that really pisses people off. You know, that's not something people forget. It's dehumanizing. So the notion of surveillance, the invasion of privacy, the inappropriate use of your data, these are areas, again, where I think we can organize, where there's not an easy opposition answer to those concerns.
So, hi.
Your questions are so easy. Be meaner.
Hi. So
You're supposed to start like, hello, I hate you.
I would never say such a thing.
See?
My name is Yasmin Kuzi. I'm a professor here. I teach human rights law, and this semester I taught AI and human rights. So my question is, first of all, thank you so much for this inspired lecture. It was really food for thought. So my question is, public discourse on AI systematically has been avoiding considering AI's environmental costs. Given the power asymmetries that you highlighted regarding specifically the national governments in effectively regulating AI, the lack of power, the lack of specific legislation, and the capabilities of governments in local levels, I would like to ask you, what are your thoughts on an international convention or initiatives in an international level regarding AI governance? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, 3 quick parts. I do think the notion of demanding an international governance model has tremendous historic precedence. When you think about the chaos of how nuclear weapons were first developed and what could have been, and there was both within government and in the public a great desire for some regime, some international standard to govern conduct, and it actually worked because we're here and we're alive right now. If it hadn't worked, we would be in a post-apocalyptic movie. So that's a happy thing. So we're not in that movie. So the fact is there's a lot of meaningful examples of a movement of people and of governments at all levels demanding that kind of action, and I think we need that to be part of the discussion, because it will move public opinion, and it will put pressure on governments to act, even if it will take quite a while. Clearly, the climate treaties are a great example of this. They've been helpful. Have they been transcendent? No, but they've been very helpful. So yes, I think that is a powerful path. I think the other thing to recognize is that the process by which change occurs is often a combination of a sort of informed movement of people or intellectual current combined, unfortunately, with a tragic event. I don't like, and I've seen this so many times, I don't like the role that tragedy plays in policymaking. But we have to be honest, it is an international phenomenon. It goes back generations. If we want to be sort of clinical about saving the world from the excesses of AI, we should be building our movements and building our local actions and our national actions immediately, knowing that a day is going to come where something horrible is going to happen. And that day will elevate the potential for political action much more deeply. I don't want it to happen. I don't have a perfect prediction. I know it will happen. And if we're in motion, we have the potential to do more. The last point is extremely powerful, a different venue, but a very powerful parallel is to nuclear power in the United States. In the end of the 1970s, the projection was there would be 1,000 nuclear reactors in the United States by the year 2000. In the 70s, let's say there was about 100 or so. There would be 10 times more by the year 2000. Why did that not happen? Why is nuclear power so much less of a factor in the United States? One, because of tragedy, which was the 3 Mile Island incident in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. But 2, because a movement had already been built by that point of tremendous power. And I think this one vignette I'll offer you, it's very personal for me, but it's illustrative. At the time in the 1970s, the end of the 1970s, it looked like the nuclear power industry had total control of the situation, somewhat like big tech today, that nuclear power was just going to roll over any attempt to have safety regulations that really mattered or popular will. It was just going to happen. You had to accept it. And a group of protesters in New Hampshire, and my brother Stephen Wilhelm was one of them, and I commend him for this, they came up with a very clever notion. There was a nuclear power plant being built in Seabrook, New Hampshire. And it was 1,414 protesters with no notice whatsoever at dawn one day took over the site and occupied it and effectively made it impossible for construction at the nuclear power site to continue. And that was one of those moments in the history of this issue that kind of changed public opinion and sense of possibility, because it was this massive outpouring of people. It's somewhat parallel to something like Occupy Wall Street, for example. A large number of people for the place it was in, a small number of people in a nation of 300 million. But it shocked the industry, and it shocked, in a good way, the public into recognizing that this did not have to be. It was not a given that people could resist. And that plant was never built. So I take inspirations from moments like that, and I think we have to find our examples. You make the point about the power generation needed for AI. That is a climate crisis unto itself. I could see, I always encourage people to chain themselves to buildings. That is a political statement, nothing else. I think you could see an example of people saying this site is generating so much power for the name of AI that it's endangering the planet, and we're going to prevent that personally. And that's the kind of thing that changes minds. Whoever you are, wave at me. I see
Hi,
you. Thank
hello.
you.
First of all, thank you so much for being here and for this amazing lecture. My name is Maria, and I'm a student here at FGV. And I wanted to ask you your thoughts regarding AI and intellectual property. I know that here in Brazil we don't have an specific legislation about intellectual property and AI, but I think US has, and I would like to know your thoughts and something about that.
First of all, Maria was my mother's name, so I like you.
Thank you.
Second of all, I'm impressed by your faith in the United States of America. I wish it was true. No, we do not have, I mean, we have intellectual property laws, but we don't have anything that's keeping up with the dynamics of AI. There's some talk about legislation to address deep fakes, for example. And I should mention this, you know, I think there's a few areas where you may see a bipartisan consensus in the nearer term in the United States. I think deep fakes are very troubling across the partisan spectrum. There's also a piece of legislation, if anyone is thinking this is a pleasant lecture, this is where it gets very unpleasant, so get ready. There's a piece of legislation before the United States Congress to guarantee legally that AI is not used in the initiation of the nuclear launch codes for our nuclear weapons. Now, the fact that that requires a piece of legislation gives you that eerie feeling that, in fact, that could happen until it's stopped. So for everyone who saw Terminator 2, I thought it was fantasy. I'd really like it to be fantasy, but the fact is we still haven't addressed entirely the use of AI by the military to protect ourselves. But to your point, I think you will see pieces of it. I don't think you're going to see in the near term thorough legislation on intellectual property. Again, there are some elements of that that could certainly be done at a state level. But this is where I think you're going to see a crisis occur. You obviously, I'm sure some people paid attention to the workers' strike in Hollywood, the writers and the actors who were striking in large measure because of AI potentially replacing their roles. They did a very good job and won a lot of concessions. But that's an individual labor deal. That's not legislation.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh, come on. Someone must have a question. You don't count, Dario. There's a Swiss guy in the room. He's not Brazilian.
You criticized all those people for being good cops, so try me at least be a little bit of a bad cop.
Here comes this whole Teutonic efficiency thing. Okay, go ahead.
No, I won't. You started talking about AI, and then you criticized the U.S. for not having yet some laws about AI, and that the European Union is already working on it, and so on. So, you were the mayor of the largest city in the United States. What's your role? How could you really influence like AI legislation? And do you have any examples of your 8 years as a mayor of the largest city of some legislation that originated in New York that made it to the actual US Senate floor, House floor, or even to the global stage?
Yes, no, and no. So, I'm self-critical. I didn't understand it. And that's not like, that's not a legal defense. But it's true. I did not understand the magnitude of the problem. I understood the danger of automation, but not the fuller danger of AI. And I will say I was exactly in the trap that I suggested earlier. I was dealing with income inequality and education and housing and homelessness and all. I'm not saying that's an acceptable excuse. I don't think it is. From where I am now, the moment I got out of office and I could actually think and read and talk to people, I was in shock that I didn't understand. And I do think it's a reminder to all of us that, most public servants are incredibly busy people, but they need to hear your voice. Like, they need you to educate them too. Whoever they are, appointed official, elected official, an advocate, like, they need to hear from those who understand the issue better to show them sometimes what they can do. We did some work on, as I said, reducing and making transparent police surveillance. We did work on the algorithms around employment, but these are not the central issues to me. The much bigger issue is how to constrain the development of AI for purposes that are not in the public interest, and to create safeguards. And we did not emanate legislation for that at all. Now, if you said you have a magic wand and you're going to make me mayor right now, I would know exactly what to do because I've had a 2-year hiatus to learn. And there's many things a local official with a platform could do, including creating more energy for the legislation that does exist. As I said, there's the nuclear launch code legislation. There is real legislation starting to develop around intellectual property. Every piece of that is helpful. We are structurally not in a place to do the European Union model until we have a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate and a Democratic President. But for example, if we did, mayors and governors could have a huge impact pushing, let's say, a second Biden administration to go in a much more aggressive direction. And even those of us outside could do that. And I would certainly intend to.
We're going to have a last question.
We were just warming up.
Which will be
we were just, what? Nah. Well, I thought this was like the 1/4 of the way point. I thought, this is, wow. So you're saying Brazilians are weak? You're saying you're not strong enough to ask more questions? I'm going to start an international incident like, hey, did you hear what he said? No, I'm joking. It was a joke. You're strong, beautiful, wonderful people who are inspirations to the entire world.
I want to raise a question
on
regulatory coordination, which is very important for us in regulation, in the regulation field. I remember that during the pandemic, you faced many, many problems with the federal government, that is Donald Trump. So I would like to ask you to speak a little bit about that.
Well, I think it's important. Some people in this room may love Donald Trump, some people may hate him, and some people may not have an opinion, although I will say Donald Trump is a topic that usually people have an opinion on. So Donald Trump and I did not get along at all before the pandemic. We were very, very politically opposed. But then, New York City was the epicenter. It was the first really, truly hard-hit part of the country. And we needed federal help. There was no way we could address this alone. And I had to have conversations with Donald Trump where I was trying to be nice to him and stroke his ego, which, that's definitely the way to work with him. So, I tried to be respectful and nice, and sometimes there were glimmers of an actual conversation. And he would say, one member of his team would follow up and it would actually happen, and other times were absolutely surreal, disconnected from reality. Like, I had no idea what he was talking about. I had had an experience a few years earlier. We had the potential for a very, very serious outbreak of Ebola in New York City. And we had a case, and there was a fear it was going to lead to much more. And I had the occasion to speak to President Obama during that crisis a couple of times, and it was as different as you could possibly imagine with two people who held the same title. Because Obama, everything was thoughtful and scientific and calm, and you know, the federal government was going to lead and take responsibility because it was a national and international problem. That said, I'm going to say something, you know, as we have the cultural thing we talk about, maybe it's from the Catholic world, that a thunderbolt hits you if you say something sinful. So a thunderbolt will probably hit me. You might want to sit farther away. But I will give Donald Trump credit and his administration for the vaccine. Not alone, but they actually did do a lot of the right things to get the vaccine to happen. And then, of course, he turned against his own vaccine. That's kind of strange. But it was not a one-way street. It was not just one thing or another. It was never consistent. And the same with the state government. In fact, the state government was often very aggressive and unhelpful to New York. So the point in that, I learned this the hard way a long time ago. This is true in the United States. I imagine it's true in most democracies. The idea that a national government, a state or regional government, and a municipal government are going to share a common interest and act in a collegial manner, even if they're in the same party, is not believable by and large. If they're in different parties, it's ridiculous. And it's not something to curse. It is the nature of humanity that people have different interests and play out their interests. And the view from the ground is very different from the view in the national capital. Now, do I think people should be better? Yes. As I said, during Obama, there was some rationality and some actual federal leadership. And, you know, you could see a model of sort of the three levels being more aligned. But in general, that difference between governments, it's frustrating. But I think everyone is better off being armed by the realism of recognizing it is the nature of democracy. You know, we all like to say how messy democracy is. It is messy. It's also the only path forward. And certainly when we come back to finish it with the AI issue, you know, with all the imperfections of a democratic system, it's the only thing that will save us from the excesses of artificial intelligence. Like, there's no way in the world an autocratic system does that for us. So, and in fact, that ability to act locally and have the independence, you know, federal systems are frustrating, but they also offer a lot of opportunity outside the national capital. So I say, let's take our messy, imperfect democracy and use it to humanize this equation and find the tools, find the opportunities, find the venues for action quickly that can change this trajectory on artificial intelligence before it really negatively affects our lives. And the last thing is just to say, please, everyone, if something I'm saying is meaningful to you, interpret it as an affirmation of your own agency. Interpret it as a commendation, as a compliment to your ability to have an impact. Everyone in this room has a certain reach. You're here because you have achieved certain things in life. You have certain networks. You have certain capacity. If you think something needs to be done on artificial intelligence, take it upon yourself to find your way of contributing to that effort for change. Thank you very much.
So one last word. One last word. How do you like Rio?
I love Rio. Okay. This is, Rio is the New York City of Brazil if New York City were as pretty as Rio.
Thank you so much. Bom, first of all, I'd like to express my deep gratitude to our guests, Professor Elliott, Professor Wendy, Professor and former Mayor of New York City, de Blasio. Thank you so much for coming and be with us here. Eu gostaria de agradecer a todos por terem participado. Essa foi uma semana bem intensa, né? A nossa Regulation Week foi a primeira semana voltada à regulação, e como eu disse no início, esse não é mais um evento, né? A gente pretende que não seja um evento, e sim um movimento a favor dos debates nacionais e também sendo o hub nacional para um debate internacional sobre os impactos da regulação, a intervenção estatal no ambiente econômico e também os reflexos sociais. Então, muito obrigado a todos que participaram, todos aqueles que patrocinaram o Regulation Week, os escritórios, as entidades que apoiaram o nosso evento. E foi um sucesso, felizmente, e o ano que vem, certamente, nós estaremos de volta no Regulation Week. Muito obrigado.